So guys, what's up? Today we are gonna see what if Naruto was get a gift Musuko in DxD verse special movie. Let go on video and please subscribe guys. The Kinkaku-ji Temple was one of the most popular tourist destinations in all of Kyoto. History states that it had originally been built by a powerful statesman named Saionji Kitsune before being bought by a shogun whose son later transformed it into a Zen temple. The temple had a long history and many people visited it, whether they be tourists or residents of the city. The temple never lacked for visitors of various types who gossiped about the temple's long history, and many people who considered themselves experts on the temple's history often gave tours of the place. If only those supposed experts knew how little they actually knew of the place and its true history. Currently, the temple was empty due to the late hour, and the setting sun illuminated the ancient place that still held various secrets hidden within. The sun reflected off the temple, giving it an ethereal glow that made it look almost magical. A place that reminded those who visited of times when they believed that supernatural creatures walked among them, and the temple was a center of great many secrets. One of those secrets was shown when a small portal opened up near the gates of the temple, invisible to any and all non-yokai thanks to the various illusions and spells built and maintained by the temple guards. Out of said portal came a running red-orange furred fox-like creature with 8 tails before the portal closed behind him. The creature was a marvelous specimen, being larger than the largest dog with fur so red it was almost crimson. Its 8 tails were long and thin instead of being short and fluffy like most fox tails, seeming almost like tentacles than tails. This was because it wasn't a normal fox but rather a kitsune, a species of yokai whose power is denoted by its number of tails, with 9 being the highest, strongest and, according to legend anyway, wisest of all. Normally, the sight of such an obviously supernatural creature would have caused any humans to panic, but luckily, the late hour meant there was no one near the temple. Yet even if any mortal had been around at the time, they would not have given the obvious yokai a second glance. This was thanks to the various illusions placed on both around the temple and the ones the kitsune himself placed on him, weak and basic though the latter were. Despite being a kitsune, none as master illusionists, illusions had never been this particular kitsune's forte. However, he knew enough to hide his presence from human sight like all yokai were required to in this day and age. However, even if he hadn't placed illusions hiding his presence, the humans would have only seen him for barely a second before he disappeared from sight. The kitsune moved so fast that anyone who saw it would believe it had been nothing more than a mirage or a trick of the light from the setting sun. The kitsune wasted no time in leaving the temple grounds, running out toward the wider Kyoto city. Soon after the kitsune disappeared from the temple grounds, the portal he exited from opened once more. Unlike before, the portal did not close behind the person after they stepped through, as they seemed to look around as if searching for something or someone. This second being had the form of a beautiful voluptuous woman with long blonde hair and matching golden eyes. She was wearing a red and white shrine maiden outfit that somehow seemed both majestic and regal despite its simplicity while highlighting her magnificent curves. The woman in question was so beautiful that anyone who beheld her would agree that she could pose as a model and become very successful doing so if it wasn't for the fact that she gave off an air closer to royalty that denied her ever participating in such an act. Yet while she seemed very different from the previous person to walk through the portal, she had one thing in common. That was the fact that she had multiple fox tails coming from her back, just above her butt. The differences was that instead of having 8 red-orange tails, she had 9 golden furred tails that matched her hair and eyes. This was none other than Yusaka, leader and Kyuubi empress of the Japanese yokai faction. Behind her, another yokai stepped out of the portal, this one looking like a birdman of some kind which any Japanese raised person could identify as a tengu, though this one seemed much older than his empress. The tengu walked forward till he stood beside his empress. Has he run away again, Lady Yusaka? Yusaka huffed in frustration. Yes, every time we argue, it's always about the same thing. The devils, or rather his refusal to make peace with them. The frustrated look on her face became a sad and dejected one. What does he have against them? I understand not trusting them, especially with their hand in my father's corruption, but things have changed. I don't understand why he's so stubborn and violent about not making peace with them at all. Her soft golden eyes turned slightly teary in her frustration and sadness. Why won't he talk to me? Doesn't he see I am trying to create a better world for our children? The elder tengu hummed in thought. He thinks there was something more to why Kurama was so hostile toward devils, but kept his thoughts to himself. If he hadn't told Lady Yusaka the true reason he joined the revolution all those years ago, then it wasn't his place to do so. Well, regardless, Lord Kurama will be back soon enough. He's never gone for longer than a week at most. For now, we should return to the capital. That argument must have tired you out, especially in your condition. At his words, Yusaka's hands went to her stomach, specifically her womb, where she had just found out 3 days ago that a life was growing. She had yet to tell her mate and husband about the pregnancy. She had hinted at having children beforehand, and Kurama had never seemed very receptive to the idea. In fact, he had seemed almost terrified at the idea of becoming a father. She knew that Kurama never had a good relationship with his own father, but she never knew the specifics. The circumstances revolving Kurama's father's death were shrouded in mystery, and she believed that whatever happened was at the core of Kurama's fear. However, any attempt to talk about it ended in failure. He seemed determined to not bring up the past in any way, and any attempt to do so caused him to react violently, so she had learned to simply not bring it up to keep the peace. Due to this, she was extremely reluctant to tell him about her pregnancy. Afraid of how he would react, not to mention that she knew that as the pregnancy developed, she would grow weaker and weaker to nourish the life growing in her wound. Eventually she would need to pass the managing of the ley lines to Kurama or risk losing her growing child. She could do both, but that would keep her almost completely bedridden during her entire pregnancy, something she was not willing to risk with the current government being so new and unstable. This meant she would have to tell Kurama so he could take over ruling during her pregnancy, though she was afraid of what he would do with that power at his disposal. His hatred towards devils and his desire to cut any and all contact with them left her disinclined to passing on rulership to him. Even if it was temporarily, he would undo all the work she had done over the past year to heal the rift between yokai and devils caused by the revolution and their hand in it. "I guess you're right," said Yasaka reluctantly, with one last look toward where she felt her husband was heading. The Empress followed her advisor back through the portal where it closed behind them. Back with the first kitsune, now known as Kurama, the male kitsune easily ran through the human alleys, so similar to the ones he lived in during his later teenage years. During that time, he had had nothing but his sister, his wits and his own strength keeping him alive, and many times, it had almost not been enough. For his sister, it hadn't been, yet he had survived, and not only that but thrived, becoming one of the most powerful yokai in Inner Kyoto. The fact that he was a hybrid only further magnified his success, rubbing his nose at all those purists who believed that only those of pure blood could achieve such power. Yet despite his great strength, even he was weaker than his wife due to her mastery of channeling the power of the ley lines. Something that galled him deeply. Kurama was someone who believed that one's strength was defined by one's strength of will to overcome adversity and obstacles, and the fact that his wife was stronger than him despite having never earned it or suffered a single day in her life frustrated him deeply. The fact that he had yet to achieve his own ninth tail while his wife had achieved her years ago only made it worse. The eight-tailed kitsune eventually entered a small clearing that had a small pond in the middle. The place was special to Kurama, being a place with one of his few happy memories. He remembered playing in this very clearing with the only one of his family members who had loved him unconditionally during his childhood, even after his hybrid status was revealed. For that reason, it was sacred in his eyes, and he always made sure that it was left pristine and untouched. For this reason, the clearing had a permanent illusion over it placed there by Kurama himself, and no one but him could find it, much less enter it. He visited the place when he wanted to be alone and had spent much time making sure that no one but him could find it. His wife may mean well, but the idea of her finding this place and no doubt dragging him back for his own good was almost enough to send him into a fit of rage at the thought. The thought of anyone, even her, coming here and defiling this place with their presence was enough to make him go on a murderous rampage. The kitsune eventually slowed down once he entered the clearing, coming to a complete stop near the pond. With a flash of light, the multi-tailed fox disappeared, and a man, albeit one with 8 foxtails, took his place. The man was fairly handsome with short red-orange hair that was similar to his fur in texture and look. He was muscular, not like a bodybuilder but closer to a swimmer's physique that emphasized speed over strength. He was wearing what seemed to be a black muscle shirt and blue GI pants that clung tightly to his muscled frame. This was Kurama, husband of Empress Yasaka and former leader of the Revolutionary Army during the Yukai Civil War. The male kitsune scowled as he looked down at his reflection in the pond. He knew he should have run, but he knew that if he stayed his wife would try to force him to talk to her, thinking it would help him. She knew that if he left, he would brood and come back in a worse mood than before. Whether it was true or not, he despised being told what to do, least of all by his wife regardless of her status as the empress. The one thing he had always treasured was his independence, and his wife thinking she could tell him what to do angered him to no end. The fact that she was stronger than him and could force him to obey only deepened his anger at the situation. It reminded him too much of his childhood, too weak to please his father or defend himself from his punishments. For that reason, he left whenever he lost his constant challenges for the throne or any of their arguments, needing some time alone lest he lash out and say something that he couldn't take back. He scowled as he thought about his peace-loving wife's desire to open peace talks with the devils. The very idea of making peace with those monsters filled him with a black rage that threatened to spill out of him every time he thought of those fucking devils. He scoffed at the very idea of them wanting peace and moving on from the past. In the back of his mind, he could still hear his sister's screams and her tormentors' laughter. No, he would never forgive those devils, no matter what they said. They were no different than their ancestors. The fact they had the audacity to now forcibly turn others into their kind just made it worse. Oh sure. They may say that it was to save the species, but to Kurama that was bullshit. It was about power and nothing else. If they truly wanted to reclaim their lost numbers, they could have simply made a deal with one of the many fertility goddesses to increase their fertility and therefore their chances of getting pregnant. But no, Kami forbid they abandon their pride to ask others for help. Better to steal what isn't theirs than to give up their pride. He scoffed, and they wondered why everyone hated them. Given a choice between doing what's right and what's easy, they always choose the latter. Like he said before, a devil was a devil no matter what they said, and they would never change. Fucking abominations that should have never have existed, and if he had the chance had exterminate them all. Man, woman and child. Arg! Yelled Kurama in a rage, fucking bitch. Why can't she just listen to me for once instead of those idiot counselors? Stupid stubborn bitch. He knew he was being hypocritical. He never told her the reason behind his hatred for devils despite having asked him many times. However, he just couldn't tell her. It would mean revisiting a painful memory he had buried deep beneath his hatred of devils and those in power. The source of his greatest pain and greatest shame. Since then, he had become desperate for power, so something like that would never happen again. In this world, power decided everything, and if you didn't have power you couldn't protect anything, least of all yourself. He had a total of 8 tails and was still waiting to acquire the last one to become a true Kyuubi. His mixed blood meant that unlike his mate, he needed to work twice as hard to gain his tails. It was something that bothered him greatly, but at least it meant had earned his strength. This contrasted greatly with his pureblood wife who gained hers simply because of her blood and not because Shed worked for them. His mate's power currently exceeded his own, and he didn't like that one bit, especially since it smacked in the face of Kurama's own beliefs and pride. He had worked hard for his power and fought and scrapped for every skill and ability. The fact that she had gained hers simply for being lucky enough to be born in the right family grated him deeply, and every defeat at her hands every time he challenged her for the throne only hurt him more. While he truly cared for and loved his wife, their marriage had originally come from needing a political symbol to demonstrate the end of the Kyoto Civil War 3 years ago. As the leader and symbol of the rebellion, he married his childhood friend and the heir to the Kyoto throne, Yusaka, to symbolize the union of the past, tradition, with the promise of the future, equal rights. It not only ended the Kyoto Civil War but was a sign that things were supposed to get better for the lower classes. And overall it had. The nobility still existed but had been stripped of any political power and heavily fined for their part in supporting Yusaka's father's madness and their own part in countless atrocities. The current council was divided into 2 parts. The Advisory Council, which was made up the elected leader of each Yukai species, and the Representative Council, which was made up of representatives of each Yukai. The difference between them was that the Representative Council had more representatives depending on the population of the species. For example, the Kitsune, the most populous species, had 5 representatives compared to the 2 for the Nekomata. Of course, all power still rested in the Empress' hands, but the councils were meant to symbolize the needs of the people both in terms of species and overall population. Due to this and Yusaka's own kindness, things for the lower classes had improved tremendously compared to before the Civil War, and both Kurama and Yusaka had become the most celebrated leaders of the Yukai race in centuries. Of course, things weren't perfect. Due to him only being in 8 tails, the managing of the ley lines wasn't shared between them like it had been in previous emperors and their consorts. This was because they thought he would eventually be overwhelmed by the power like previous non-Kyuubi Kitsune had been in the past. Due to this, it was decided that Yusaka would have sole control of the ley lines until he gained his 9th tail. Of course, Kurama did not like this at all, since he believed it was simply racism due to his hybrid status. Deep down, he knew that wasn't it, but the fact that he was so close to the power he so desperately wanted yet was denied it after everything simply due to his blood angered him to no end. For this reason, he constantly challenged Yusaka for the throne in order to prove he could handle the power of the ley lines. Unfortunately, his wife not only had the large power from being a 9 tails to draw on but also tap into the magical ley lines of Kyoto, which held near limitless power. While all former Kyuubi leaders could tap into the ley line's power, none before Yusaka could channel such a large amount at once or use it in combat with such proficiency. It was a source of pride for many Yukai and a sign for the blood purists of the superiority of pure blood over mixed blood. While Kurama was very proud of his wife for this accomplishment, it was also a source of endless frustration for the proud Kitsune. Ever since he was young, he hated to be weak. After everything he endured and lost in his life due to his weakness, he sought strength above all. To be so thoroughly outclassed angered him beyond words, something shown in the fights between his wife and him. Each time he had been beaten with any injuries on Yusaka being minor and healing quickly due to the healing properties of the ley line's power. Kurama's tails moved around in agitation, kicking up dirt and breaking things as they lashed out physically, demonstrating their owner's anger. The entire situation made him want to just abandon the city and leave. Travel as he had in his teens, or even go find Kanana and take her up on her offer of living with the Nekomata. Maybe he should take her up on her offer to learn senjutsu under her. While he didn't want to abandon Yusaka, the current situation was intolerable to him. They weren't so much equals as he was a prisoner with her being the warden, forced to go along with everything she wanted without any say in the matter. But maybe if he mastered senjutsu, he would finally have the power to force her to his way of thinking. He hadn't used it since that day, but if it was what would close the gap between them, then he would anything to get the power needed. Anything. Just you wait, growled Kurama lowly. I'll get my 9th tail and master senjutsu and then we'll see who's beaten into the ground and forced to concede. Then why don't you? A voice asked from the side. Startled, his slit eyes snapped towards the voice, only to pause in slight shock at the sight. The person he saw standing behind him was a tall and pale-skinned elderly man with deep wrinkles to show his age. The elderly man had spiky, shoulder-length, pale red hair, with a chin-length braid hanging in front of his left ear as well as sporting a goatee which tapered down to his waist. Horn-like protrusions adorned his forehead while ringed patterns replaced his pupils in his eyes. He wore a white, full-length kimono with a pattern of 6 black magatama around a high collar along with a necklace which was also made up of 6 black magatama. A strange black staff was secured to his back, and he was sitting on a bench with 2 hands pressed against his knee as if they were to hold his weary body up. The demonic fox was sure he was completely alone seconds ago. His senses were sharper than normal kitsune and he had been alert in case he was followed, so how did this man sneak up on him? Kurama tensed up and prepared for a probably losing fight. Very few could avoid his senses and those that could were not to be underestimated, so for this man to so easily do this spoke volumes about his strength. The being, because he couldn't be human with those horns, looked very tired, as if he had been carrying a great weight for a very long time. Despite that, he gave off an aura of strength that bluntly told Kurama that if he fought him, he would be swept aside like a bug. This only made Kurama all the warier and he tensed up in case he had to defend himself or, as much as it irked him to admit it, run. Who are you? Kurama asked warily, taking in the mon's appearance. Had never seen such being before, but there was a first time for everything. Could it be a devil? They did tend to have numerous abilities and appearances, but something told him that this wasn't the case. He could also be some kind of half-breed yokai. The horns were similar to an onus, yet he had 2 instead of the usual one. A mutation perhaps? Shouldn't you introduce yourself first before asking another person's name? The elderly man replied with a small smile. A tick mark appeared on Kurama's forehead at being taught manners by someone who sneaked up on him, but he relented. I am Kurama, the great Kyuubi, so tell me who you are. Kurama demanded in his usual arrogant manner. It was mostly bluster since he was getting unnerved with the fact that despite being right in front of the man, he still couldn't sense his power. Was it non-existent and that was why Kurama didn't sense it? Or was he that good at hiding it? Kyuubi. Ah yes, but you're still missing 1 more tail to make it 9. The man said as he analyzed the creature before nodding approvingly. It was as if he had found what he was seeking for. I am known as Hagoromo Otsutsuki, Sage of 6 Paths. The reminder of his missing his 9th tail annoyed Kurama since it seemed as if the being was pointing out his hybrid status as the reason he lacked it despite being full grown. I will get my 9th tail. It's only a matter of time. In a few decades, nobody will challenge my powers, and I'll use it to show those asshole devils who use those evil pieces of theirs as a reason to subjugate others their place. Bawahahahaha. Kurama retorted before laughing hysterically, imagining the destruction he would wreak upon those that challenged him. Hagoromo stroked his beard a little with a free hand. He was deep in thought, allowing the young man to continue in his delusional fantasy. Hagoromo wondered if he should point out the hypocrisy of Kurama using force to subjugate them for the crime of subjugating others, but decided against it. That was a lesson that needed to be learned, not taught. After Kurama stopped being an idiot, Hagoromo finally spoke up. I am looking for a vessel, if you could help me in that regard. I am sure I can shorten the time you needed to get your final tail. I will also give you something more as a bonus. Kurama. Hagoromo offered as said person narrowed his menacing eyes at the man. Kurama was suspicious, but his desire for power and being denied it for so long had made him so desperate that it overcame his own vigilance. You can show me? Kurama demanded angrily. Hagoromo nodded. He took the strange staff from his back and tapped it against the air to his side. The air distorted around the impact point, and black lines appeared before spiraling like a whirlpool into some kind of dark portal. Kurama stepped back a little after sensing the rift in space. He had seen many strange things in his life, but never something like this. The portal pulsed with strange and unknown energy that seemed to fill the air with malicious intentions. If you accept, then follow me, as you will be the last of the 9. I can say that you will be the strongest and greatest of them. However, you will disappear from here for a little while, and one day you will meet a child of prophecy. You will help him accomplish his goal and you will be given a chance to return here again. Hagoromo hinted as Kurama's eyes narrowed even further at his words. Kurama was about to accept but suddenly hesitated. If he did this, he would effectively be abandoning his wife for an undetermined length of time. She had been one of his closest friends his entire life and his first love. She had married him despite his infamous reputation and hybrid status, and while they had their differences, they had a mostly happy marriage. He truly did love her despite everything. But if what the man said was true, what are the 9? Asked Kurama to buy time to think. The old man seemed to know the reason behind his hesitance but answered. The 9 will be known as the Biju. Each will have the ability to remodel a country and landscape with just a flick of their tail. I need them to contain a certain being's energy. They are Shukaku the Ichibi, Matabi the Nibi, Isobu the Sanbi, Son Goku the Yanbi, Kakuo the Gobi, Seiken the Rokubi, Chomei the Nanabi, Gyuki the Hachibi, and finally you, if you choose to accept, will be Kurama the Kyubi. Hagoromo answered truthfully. I will have 9 tails? The strongest? Kurama asked excitedly, visions of the power he will gain, strong enough to apparently remodel countries with ease, filling his mind and destroying any sense of caution he would usually have. Even if it was an exaggeration, it would be more than enough power to do what he wanted. Hagoromo nodded to confirm his words. However, I will need to seal your memory of this place along with your body until such time as a certain event will come to pass, he added after some thought, seeing how Kurama was quite arrogant, and that might be a bad thing if he allowed him to roam freely with that kind of behavior and the power he'll have at his fingertips. Let's do it then. Kurama howled decidedly. The sage stroked his beard and entered the portal first to show that it was safe. It was soon followed by the demon fox without any hesitation. The portal closed behind them, leaving no trace of what transpired behind them. As the sage had promised, all 9 creatures he had collected from different worlds were given a piece of Jubies. The 10 tails, powers, with Kurama gaining over half. Their memories were sealed along with their original body, and their souls were placed in a new immature one made completely out of pure chakra. All of the Biju would need to grow into it, and after the task was done, Hagoromo's body failed him and he passed away. However, before his death he told his creations that they would all be together again even if they went their separate ways. It was as if he knew what was to come far into the future. Afterwards, the 9 showed themselves from time to time, allowing the humans of the world to witness their might and powers. Eventually, they came to be called the Biju, just as the sage was predicted, considered more akin to natural disasters and demons than living creatures. At first, they were together, having a close relationship with one another. However, time passed and fragmented pieces of their former personality eventually resurfaced, causing them to slowly drift apart after a heated philosophical disagreement. Paranoia and fear of being alone, which he hid behind arrogance and an obsession with being the strongest, filled Kurama and pushed him away from his siblings and into becoming a recluse. He only ever appeared whenever he sensed arrogance and hatred fester somewhere, something within him drawing him to punish those who used their power to subjugate others. He knew the hypocrisy of his actions, causing him to hate himself, which only further fueled his hatred, creating a vicious cycle he could not escape from. Over the centuries, countless inhabitants of the elemental nations failed to regard the tailed beasts as sapient individuals, treating them with great disdain and fear due to their actions, especially Kurama's, because of the immense power each of creatures wielded. The shinobi sought out the tailed beasts as tools and weapons to be controlled. It was a sentiment they as a whole detested, but could do nothing to change it. The more they lashed out in defense of themselves, the more they were hated and treated as uncaring monsters. Despite being the most powerful, Kurama was the first to be sealed away inside a human sacrifice known as the Jinchuriki. It was angry and filled with malice, both it being imprisoned and it being treated as nothing more than a wild animal incapable of rational thought. Though to be fair, his constant threats and attempts to kill his jailer probably didn't help his case. The entire situation felt both very familiar and different to Kurama, with a jailer that forced him to obey their will and considered him as an animal, which only furthered his rage. Mito Uzumaki was the first of its jailers, followed by that bitch Kushina Uzumaki after the first reached the end of her unnaturally long lifespan. Its third and latest jailer was one called Naruto Uzumaki. The first time Kurama saw him, He wondered why the blonde boy looked so familiar with his shaggy hair and 3 whisker marks. However, the color of his hair and eyes seemed out of place in its opinion, but it didn't know exactly why. No one truly knew, not even the great sage, that a Jinchuriki, who was giving birth, would give her child some of the Biju's original traits. Thus, Naruto looked like a blonde-haired blue-eyed incarnation of Kurama's original form. Was that a coincidence or fate? Watching the orphaned boy being shunned by the entire village since his birth, Kurama decided to try and use Naruto's dependence on its power to gain control over him and break free from its cage at long last. However, through the blonde's seemingly endless struggle, Kurama's attitude toward the blonde soon began to change. Just prior to the Fourth Shinobi World War, rather than treat him as some animal or power source, the blonde treated him like an equal and even potential friend. Despite him being the reason behind all his suffering, it struck a chord in Kurama, and as Naruto proved to be different from all the others, Kurama decided that maybe it was time he gave a leap of faith of his own and trusted the blonde in turn, giving the boy his power freely. Just like Hagoromo had stated those centuries before, the 9 were united once more in a single body to defeat powerful enemies that sought to erase everyone from existence, and they finally brought forth the much-desired peace. After a great and costly battle, Naruto Uzumaki emerged victorious. It was against all odds, but with the help of the 9, he did the impossible, and Hagoromo Otsutsuki appeared before them once more. Thank you. This is how it should be. I am glad you all have completed the task I foresaw those centuries ago. I saw the end if you were not here to prevent it. As such, you have my deepest gratitude. I will return you all back to your homes, the place where you belonged originally, like I've promised all those years ago, Hagoromo said, and explained that he took them from their home even though they did not remember. He was desperately searching for a way to change the dark future in his vision at the time, and so had gone to their worlds in hopes of finding it. But hasn't thousands of years had already passed? Asked Shukaku curiously. Time is relative and flows differently, Shukaku, explained Hagoromo patiently. You might have experienced thousands of years here, but I will send you back to the same time you left. Maybe a year or two later, you will regain your original form along with the newfound ability as promised. I can also erase your memory of the elemental nations if you so desire. After some debate, the first 8-tailed beasts accepted the offer and wanted to return to the life they would know again. Some of them chose to remove the memory of the elemental nations along with all the pain they suffered during their unjust imprisonment, not wanting it to cloud their future actions in the new home. However, Kurama was hesitant to leave the blonde as he was now part of his life, and it felt wrong to abandon him now after all they've been through. Hey Kurama, we made a great team, didn't we? Asked Naruto with a bright smile. Kurama smiled in return and nodded in agreement. Naruto was living proof that true power came from strength of character and the will to make the impossible possible. Throughout their struggles together, it had its moments of doubt, but Naruto had showed none of that. The boy, who was shunned most of his life, would climb over all the challenges and prove to those that did not believe that he would not back down from his belief no matter what the challenge. It had inspired everyone around him and united a once war-torn world together. The Jubi was powerful, exceeding its own power, but still lost to their teamwork in the end. Madara and Kagaya, a god and goddess possibly, were no different. They were all defeated, one after another, as Hagoromo had foreseen all those millennia ago. Child of prophecy, Kurama muttered as Naruto grinned proudly. Ah, so that's how it is, thought Hagoromo, looking at Naruto. The boy's appearance was like the humanoid Kurama, and he knew then that the Kyuubi would have a hand in bringing forth the boy's existence and thus saving the future. Hagoromo simply smiled and returned the rest of the 8 beasts back to their own world, allowing Naruto and Kurama some time to discuss where they would go from here onward. The sage felt completely drained afterwards, but kept his composure. He wasn't sure if there was enough powers in him to send the last one back. I think I will stay here for a while, Kurama finally requested after some thought. The sage nodded, understanding the Kyuubi's reason. Naruto couldn't be happier that it chose to stay behind with him. Kurama was then resealed back into Naruto as it felt much more comfortable in there once it had been combined with his yin half. Furthermore, as the sage had also hinted, Kurama still needed to help the blonde with the corruptive nature of all the tail beast's chakra that were now coursing through his inner pathways. As the two once separated halves reunited, that would change, but for now, Naruto still needed him. This time, however, Kurama wasn't being tied down or locked in a cage. Very well. Come back here when you are ready to return, said Hagoromo. He drew up the seal before continuing to speak. This seal will activate upon your blood, Naruto. It will open a portal, but only once. You or your children will be the one to send Kurama back to his home one day. It will also return your original memory and body as well, Kurama. Is that another thing you foresaw? Naruto asked curiously. But Hagoromo shook his head. He felt that he was fading away as he channeled the last of his energy into the time-space seal. It should be good for one being to pass through, and hopefully that was enough. I can see nothing now, so I cannot say what is to come in the future, but make it a good one, Naruto and Kurama, my son, Hagoromo said with a wide smile before fading away, at peace at last. Are you crying? Asked Naruto amusedly, hearing the whimpering noise in his mindscape. Shut up, brat. I am not crying. Just something in my eyes, damn dusts, Kurama growled in denial as Naruto rolled his eyes and chuckled. Right. Let's return home and start rebuilding. Naruto roared happily, jogging back to the devastated Leaf Village and meeting up with the rest of the Allies' forces along the way. The costly war was over and the future would be something they would make for themselves. Near the mountain's graveyard, Elemental Nations, 146 years later. A much older and weathered Naruto stood before the seal placed by the Sage of Six Paths almost a century and a half ago. His once blonde hair had turned white with age and the once proudly standing shinobi was now slightly hunched over from age. Even with the Uzumaki vitality, he was reaching the end of his lifetime, which was the reason he was standing here today. Naruto reached towards the seal on his stomach and twisted it slightly. In a flash of light, Kurama, the last Biju, appeared beside him in all his glory, looking sadly down at his oldest friend. Are you sure about this, Kit? Asked Kurama quietly. Well, quietly for him, for any normal person, he was shouting. I can always just go hide somewhere remote where they can't find me, that way I can come help keep the peace if it's necessary. Naruto smiled sadly and shook his head. I am sure, Kurama, we can't risk them finding you and sealing you away like they're planning to my soon-to-born great-great-grandchild. They might say it's to ensure the peace, but we both know the truth. They're just power-hungry and I won't have my oldest friend used as a weapon again. And we both know that's what you'll eventually be turned into if you're sealed again. Kurama huffed but conceded the point. His partner had done much in his long life. His greatest accomplishment was, of course, bringing peace to the elemental nations, which continued to this day. His reign had been the longest and most celebrated in history, lasting over 60 years before he retired the hat to Satsuki, Sasuke's granddaughter. While not of his blood, she had inherited the will of fire even more than Naruto's son, Boruto, had. Satsuki accomplished her mother, Sarada's, dream and became the first Uchiha Hokage. She continued many of the laws and beliefs he had founded during his reign and ensured the peace continued. Even Kurama had to admit that for an Uchiha, she was alright. Unfortunately, her successor and Naruto's great-grandson, Minato, named after his great-great-grandfather, was of a much different mindset. While he wanted to keep the peace, he believed in taking a much more proactive approach to it, stamping out possible threats to the peace before they could form. He reminded Kurama of what he had heard that old geezer Danzo had been like when he was young and not in a good way. While he understood reacting quickly to threats, his way would make more enemies than he would destroy due to his methods. If he saw something that could someday be a threat, he didn't try and settle it peacefully but viciously stamped it out by any means necessary. It had made many of the other Kage uncomfortable already and things were becoming tense. The peace that had lasted for over a century looked to be reaching its end. The brat had become this way due to his father's death at the hands of a successor group of Akatsuki when he was young. The group had been talked about in whispers before but mostly ignored due to their small size and the fact that they had done nothing to warrant hostility. The fact that there was no way they could be anywhere near the threat the original Akatsuki had been, only having at most a rank shinobi in their ranks, meant even Kurama dismissed them as unimportant. However, his friend's grandson and Boruto's son, Menma, had thought otherwise and became suspicious of what their goals were. He eventually investigated their activities and found that they had been trying to create their own Biju using traces of Kurama and his siblings' chakra still left at the mountain's graveyard. They had also managed to turn themselves into pseudo-Jinchuriki using the traces of Biju chakra left, much like the Gold and Silver brothers had been, making them much more dangerous than their perceived rankings said they were. Menma had died trying to stop them but failed. Luckily, he had managed to send a message back to inform the villages of their plan before he died. The villages had quickly banded together and had managed to stop the group soon afterwards, even destroying all trace of their research personally, much to the chagrin of the people more in line with Minato's current way of thinking. But the damage had been done. Naruto had lost a son and Minato, a father. Boruto had died soon afterwards as well, the loss of his son sapping most of his will to live, meaning Minato lost his grandfather soon after as well. It had been that event that caused his friend to retire from being Hokage, believing he had lost his edge in his old age despite Kurama's protests to the contrary. The fact that his friends were all getting old and dying had only helped with the decision, since he wanted to spend the last few years of his friends' and wife's life with them rather than behind a desk. The following years had been mostly good if a bit boring. Satsuki had been a great Hokage and Naruto got to spend much time with his family and friends. Kurama still smiled at how happy his friend had been helping to raise his grandchildren and later great-grandchildren. Kurama himself had become slightly attached to them and would often leave the seal to play with them. It was hard to think of him as a force of destruction when he had children using him as an improvised jungle gym as he pretended to sleep. However, others hadn't forgotten his power and seeing him free had made whispers of what to do with him once Naruto died to start. It had deeply angered Kurama to hear once again them treat him as a weapon rather than as a sentient being, and he had become grumpy in the past few years as the talks increased. It had warmed Kurama's heart to see Naruto fight so fiercely to protect his freedom even if both knew it was a losing battle. As Naruto grew older and approached the end of his life, his words started to have considerably less sway. The fact that he was the last of his generation alive meant that he was mostly considered an old relic to the current generation, most considering his feats as nothing more than hyperbole at most. They only had to wait till Naruto was close to death and too weak to stop them in order to what they wanted, and the fact that they were headed by his own great-grandson broke Naruto's heart. Knowing that soon they would force the issue, Naruto had come to this place to turn the decision moot. He would activate the seal the sage had created all those years ago, opening the portal and return Kurama to his true home. That way Kurama would be completely out of their reach, and to ensure it, Naruto would destroy the seal after Kurama went through. That way, there would be no way for anyone to follow. Kurama grumbled, "If I go, you won't last much longer, Naruto. My chakra has been what's been keeping you alive all these years. Without me, you'll have maybe a month or two at most." Naruto just smiled serenely, no fear of his upcoming death on his face. "Good, that means I'll live long enough to see the birth of my great-great-grandchild at least. Plus, I think I've kept Hinata, Boruto and Himawari waiting long enough. They've been waiting for me for years. I think it's time to see them again, don't you think?" Kurama looked down at his oldest friend as he finally spoke the real reason he was so hesitant to leave. "I don't want to leave you, Naruto. I'll miss you." There, the real reason why he was so reluctant to leave spilling from his mouth before he could stop it. He had grown attached to the boy. Seeing all his struggles and successes resonated within Kurama, as if he recognized something within Naruto. Kurama could honestly say that Naruto was his best and closest friend, and the idea of leaving him, of not being there when he died at least, hurt Kurama deeply. Naruto smiled widely at his old friend, tears in his eyes to show how much having to do this hurt him as well. "I know, Kurama, I'll miss you too, but it would hurt even more to know you'll be caged once again after I am gone. At least this way, we can both part ways happily, and who knows?" Naruto shrugged with a smile on his face. "Maybe you have a family of your own waiting for you on the other side." That brought Kurama up short. He had never really thought about what could be waiting for him on the other side. The idea that he might have a family, a real family, waiting for him actually made him want to see if it's true. On the other hand, the opposite could be true and he could be completely alone on the other side. Worse, he could be a completely different person, more similar to who he had been before he became friends with Naruto. That was what scared him the most, the idea that he would be a different person that would shame his closest friend's memory. Naruto seemed to know what he was thinking as he laid a hand on his left front paw and patted him slightly. "I am sure that whoever you were before won't change who you are now, Kurama. I believe in you." Kurama met his old friend's eyes and sighed in resignation. Over 100 years old and still more stubborn than an ox, Kurama nodded to show his acceptance. Naruto smiled and pricked his finger lightly, letting a few drops of blood to land on the seal. Instantly, the seal began to glow brightly, showing it was activating. Naruto took a few steps back and watched as a line of black seals appeared in midair before opening a giant hole just big enough for Kurama to fit into what seemed like nothingness. Both friends looked at each other, realizing this was it. The two shared one final fist bump, manfully ignoring the tears going down both their cheeks. "Well, I guess I'll see you around, Kit," said Kurama, using all his strength not to fall down bawling. "Try not to get into too much trouble after I am gone. I won't be there to bail you out." Naruto just gave a soft smile, also using all his determination, stubbornness, not to fall into tears at saying goodbye to his oldest friend. It was as hard as the day Hinata died. At least then he knew he would see her in the pure world someday. Now, he didn't even have that comfort. "Goodbye, Kurama. I am sure we'll see each other again someday." Kurama smiled at the hopeful optimism in his friend's voice. "Goodbye, my friend," and with that, Kurama stepped through the portal, leaving the elemental nations behind. After the portal closed, Naruto stood there for a moment before standing over to where the seal once was and scuffing the used seal so it couldn't be studied. He didn't have to do anything more. His tears would wash away the rest. Kyoto, Japan. Deep inside the residential district of Kyoto, There was a small clearing with a pond in the middle. No one, not even Yukai, could see the clearing, which meant it was safe from the residential expansions of the last 2 decades. However, because of that, the clearing showed signs of neglect, with grass being overgrown and the pond water being slightly wild and murkier than it used to be. It all showed that no one had been there in a very long time. Suddenly, the seemingly peaceful silence was broken when a dark portal opened near the water. The portal stood there for a moment before a figure fell out of it and it closed, no sign of it ever having been there. The figure groaned slightly and it stood, showing Kurama in his new, old form, except now with 9 tails swaying behind him. Kurama rubbed his head as the memories settled into his mind. Luckily, having lived for over 3 millennia, the extra memories of about 30+ years were just a drop in the bucket in comparison, so the headache passed quickly. He stepped toward the small lake, and while it was slightly dirtier than he remembered, he could still see his reflection. The first thing he noticed was how similar he looked to Naruto, which was both a comfort and a dagger in the heart, since it meant he would never forget his friend. The second thing he noticed was the chakra pathways in his body. It seemed the seal compensated for the presence of chakra and gave him similar pathways to shinobi, so he could use both chakra and yuki. It meant he was much stronger than he ever was, and Kurama grinned at the thought of all the power now at his fingertips. Speaking of power, Kurama remembered his recent, technically speaking, humiliation at the hands of his wife and smiled toothily before starting to cackle. Oh yeah. Payback time. With another dark cackle, Kurama pushed off toward the direction of his home, intent on giving his new abilities a good workout. Kurama eagerly walked out of the clearing, after making sure to reinforce the illusion once more, in the direction of the nearest entrance to Inner Kyoto, which just so happened to be the official one at Kinkakuji Temple. As he did so, his mind wandered over his new, old memories and the differences between the old him and the current one. For one thing, while he wanted to go back to fight his wife, it wasn't so much anger as it was pride and his admittedly chauvinistic desire to prove he's the alpha in the relationship. While before he would have wanted to beat her more out of anger and to avenge the humiliation of losing to someone else, even if that someone else was his wife, now it was more to prove his strength and establish himself as the strongest. A slight difference but important, since it meant his fight with Yusaka was more of a spar than a real fight. That, and it had been a long time for him, literally millennia. So once he beat her in the spar, he was throwing her over his shoulder and dragging her to their bedroom, where he had no intention of them leaving for anything except for food or the bathroom for the next 2 weeks. Cavemanish. Yes, did her care? Not one whit. You try and go millennia without sex and see how you'll react, especially when your wife looked like Yusaka did. Kurama's once fast sprint toward the Kinkakuji Temple slowed to a stop as he left the more rural area and entered the more urbanized districts. He stopped because it only took one look at the urbanized area to realize that much more time had passed since his disappearance than just 1 or 2 years. For one, the buildings were taller and obviously more advanced. Buildings of cement and stone had been replaced with what seemed like glass and metal buildings. While not new in any shape or form, they had definitely not been common in more traditional Kyoto. There was still plenty of greenery and traditional buildings, but they seemed to be set more in the outskirts than in central Kyoto proper. Another sign was the different fashion styles he saw from what he remembered. While not that different, which luckily meant not much more than a decade had passed at most, there was enough of a difference that it was noticeable. And was that one girl wearing a pink wig? He continued to walk and eventually stopped when in front of Kyoto train station, where a bullet train was just arriving. That more than anything confirmed his fears. While the plans for building the bullet train had already been underway, it had been years away from being completed, much more than just a single year, for it to not only be completed but seemingly having been in smooth operation for more than a year. From the way no one seemed fazed by its presence was very telling. The entire thing made Kurama very uneasy, and he hastened his pace toward the Kinkakuji Temple. He needed to know how much time had passed since he left this world. For him it had been millennia, but the old man had promised that no more than a year or 2 would pass in this world. Did the old man lie? No, the old man never lied to him, even about things Kurama would have preferred to be lied to about. He had always been brutally honest, and it had been one of the things he had loved about him, so he wouldn't lie about something like this. The only thing Kurama could think of was the time he stayed after the end of the 4th Shinobi War. Maybe staying all those years with Naruto afterwards caused more time to pass in this world, especially without the old man there to make sure he arrived on time. But if that was true, then just how much time had passed? Was time between the 2 dimensions equal, or did more time pass in one world compared to the other? Along the way, his thoughts came to a halt when he saw 2 new hotels. Specifically, the Kyoto Sirzex and Kyoto Serifal hotels, the latter still undergoing construction. Kurama's power exploded. A snarl of rage coming to his face, and every human within 100 yards passed out from the pressure of his power. He recognized those names very well. How could he not know the names of two of the new Mao? But why the hell were their names on hotels in the middle of Kyoto? The heart of Yukai territory? The only reason he could think of for devil names to be on buildings in Kyoto would be if the devils had invaded and conquered it. Either that or his idiotic and naive wife was actually stupid enough to allow them to build them here. If it was the latter, he would need to have a talk with his wife about this. There was no way he was allowing devils to build businesses here, in the heart of their territory. Allowing devils to build within their territory was going way too far in his mind. It was no different than angels allowing devils building a business in heaven, something he doubted even 2 millennia of peace between them would ever allow. Even if they were no longer enemies, there was no way he was going to trust them within their territory. No matter what they said, devils would use that as a foothold to try and force Yukai into their so-called peerages for their own selfish gains. Until the devils had proven themselves to be different from their ancestors, there was no way he was allowing them the chance to further abuse their ability to enslave others in the name of regaining their numbers. First thing he was going to do after he had re-established himself was throw out any and all devil buildings and businesses within Kyoto. Not only because they had no business within another faction's territory, but they were also stealing away business and income that belonged to them. Any businesses owned by devils would be staffed by them, and unless Yukai became part of a peerage, they would have to work for lower wages than they would normally receive for such a job. This would cause the percentage of poor to increase among the Yukai, not to mention cause much resentment both towards devils and Yusaka, who allowed it. Stuff like that was what caused civil wars. Only idiots believed civil wars began over stuff like differing ideals. In the end, all civil wars boiled down to the resentment one side feels toward another for some perceived injustice. Whether or not this injustice is true is irrelevant. Only the perception of the one slighted mattered, and if they felt they were being abused in some way, the resentment started to fester until eventually they rebelled, causing civil war. It was stuff like this that convinced Kurama that people born into riches had no business ruling. Ruling had less to do with politics than it had to with economics, the love of the people and pure undiluted ruthlessness. If you lacked any of the three, civil war was the inevitable conclusion. Kurama tsked in annoyance, looked like he had a lot of work to do, and he hadn't even been back for 10 minutes. As he approached the temple, he took stock of his power level and smiled smugly. It seemed as if all his chakra as the Kyuubi Biju had mixed perfectly with his Yuki. In fact, he could sense his chakra feeding his Yuki, making it even stronger like gasoline to a flame. It made sense since chakra was the origin of all things, including Yuki. All powers stemmed originally from chakra, which was the energy of life, so his endless chakra was basically feeding his Yuki until it reached the maximum a 9 tails could hold, which easily put him in the topmost tier of ultimate class beings, easily on par with a Satan. Furthermore, he could sense that he now had a chakra system much like Naruto and the other shinobi did. This meant he could possibly do many of the jutsu and techniques they could, and with the millennia of watching their various techniques, he had a large library to choose from. Kurama smiled toothily, lust for battle and conflict running through his veins. He couldn't wait to test out his newfound power on someone. As a Biju, he had been powerful enough to reshape the landscape with just a flick of one of his tails. Now all that power had been condensed into his more compact form, making it that much more powerful. He could already sense that in his current form, he could easily kill an entire group of ultimate class devils with ease. Kurama eventually reached the Kinkaku-ji temple, gaining a few odd looks due to his attire, but considering the various people dressed in much weirder stuff, he swore he saw this one guy dressed as some kind of fairy girl or something. It was nothing that attracted much attention, especially with his fox features hidden. He put up an illusion that would not only hide what he was doing but also make anyone who approached his vicinity suddenly remember important meetings elsewhere. Reaching out into seemingly empty air, Kurama pulsed his yoki in a certain pattern, hoping it hadn't changed in his time away, and was rewarded by the appearance of a portal into inner Kyoto. Walking through, Kurama entered the inner capital and smiled as he saw the familiar buildings of his home. When it was first built, this Yukai or inner Kyoto looked almost exactly like Japan did during the Heian period. Both socially and in looks, art and literature were held in high esteem during that time, and homes were made with artistic inclinations in mind rather the utilitarian mindset of the modern world. It had been a beautiful and picturesque slice of ancient Japan that was preserved even as the outer world continued to advance. In time, it had slowly kept up with some modern advancements. Especially when almost all of Yukai kind moved into the inner city after the end of the feudal era and the passing of the worldwide agreement for all supernatural beings to fade into myth in the minds of humanity as a whole. Nowadays, it looked closer to the Edo period of Japan, with only the poorest districts showing some signs of its original Heian architecture. In the richer districts, it was a beautiful blend of Heian artistic beauty and Edo period strict social order. from the fact that there was no buildings on fire or dead bodies lying around. There obviously hadn't been a battle recently. He inhaled deeply and nodded when he smelled no lingering smell of blood or smoke that would have lingered even months after a battle, which together with the untouched Yukai architecture meant the devils hadn't invaded, which was good and bad. Good because it meant his people weren't currently at war, and bad because it meant his wife had become even more peace-obsessed in his time away. If the fact she allowed devils to build hotels in their territory meant anything, probably some way to establish good relations or whatever. Kurama shook off such thoughts as he approached the palace, which was coincidentally where he felt the devil's signatures coming from. He frowned when he realized that meant they must be meeting with Yusaka, though why there was more than one at a time when that was forbidden was unknown to him. Oh well. Time to make an entrance. Standing inside the great hall before the Yukai throne in the large mansion that served as the Yukai Palace, the Kuo Academy's second years, Rosweiss, Azazel and Seraphal conversed with Kuno and her two advisors. After clearing up the misunderstanding that led to Kuno attacking them, they were discussing Yusaka's disappearance. Yusaka Haim was going to a meeting with Sakura's messengers from Mount Meru, explained the old Tengu with a hint of anxiousness. She only took a few guards, citing that they were unnecessary. I told her to reconsider, but she ignored me and went with only a few of her elite Karasu Tengu guards. Unfortunately, she never appeared at the meeting place at the scheduled time. The old Tengu sighed as Kuna's eyes filled with slight tears. We investigated once we were informed of this and found one of her dying guards who only lived long enough to tell us she was kidnapped, but not long enough to tell us by who. Due to this lack of information on her attackers, we became suspicious of any supernatural outsiders within our city, which led to Kuno-sama attacking you before. There was a moment of silence before Azazel sighed in frustration. This kind of thing keep happening every time different factions decide to ally. The last time this happened was with Odin, right? At that time, Loki came to interfere. This time, the enemies are the terrorists. It was obvious from his tone that he was frustrated with their enemies' actions. For someone who wanted peace, he was no doubt furious at the Chaos Brigade's actions. Governor Dono, Mao Dono, could you help find a way to save Yusaka Haim? Asked the old Tengu with a hint of a plea in his tone. No matter what, we pledge our full cooperation. He reached into his clothing and pulled out a portrait of a beautiful blonde-haired kitsune woman. This is a portrait of Yusaka Haim to better help you locate her. Issei felt a blush rise to his face as he took in the picture of Kuna's mother, more specifically, her massive pair of breasts that the shrine maiden outfit only enhanced rather than detracted from. It took everything he had to prevent a nosebleed as he imagined how the beautiful Kyubi could reward him for rescuing her. As Issei went off into his own fantasy, the others continued to talk. We are not certain where exactly she is located, said the old Tengu with a frown. However, what we can be certain of is that the kidnappers are still in Kyoto. That brought Issei out of his daydream as he questioned with a frown, why do you think so? Azazel turned to him and explained, the flow of ki in all the regions of Kyoto is still stable. The nine-tailed fox is an existence responsible for maintaining the balance of ki flowing from the different areas of this land. You can consider Kyoto itself like a large-scale force field. If the Kyubi left this land or was killed, then Kyoto will undergo dramatic changes, to say the least. Since there are no signs of that, it means Yusaka Haim is still fine and the kidnappers must still be in the area. Issei looked shocked at the revelation but nodded in understanding. At least this meant the kidnappers couldn't have gone far. However, before the conversation could continue, they were interrupted when something crashed through the roof and landed between them and Kuno. Honey, I am home. Instantly, the foreign group and Kuna's guards got ready for a fight, thinking this was a terrorist attack, though the greeting did throw them off. As the dust cleared, it revealed a male kitsune Yukai with red-orange hair and eyes standing there with a smug smirk on his face and an unconcerned air about him, even with everyone aiming their weapons at him. The old Tengu paused for a moment before signaling for the guards to lower their weapons. Kurama Dono? Is that you? Asked the old Tengu unsurely. It had been many years since his disappearance, but the old Tengu recognized that arrogant smirk, plus that unique red-orange hair and eyes anywhere. Seeing that the old Tengu seemed to recognize him, the Gremory group hesitantly lowered their weapons as well, though were still wary at the newcomer. Do you recognize him, Seraphal? Asked Azazel warily. No, said Seraphal with a small frown, pout, but he's a Yukai, so I doubt he'd harm Kuno, especially since her advisor seems to recognize and trust him if the way he ordered the guards to lower their weapons is any indication. Kurama recognized a few of the faces of the ones visiting and idly wondered why both the Leviathan and Azazel were visiting together, but filed it away for later. He counted 5 reincarnated devils and 1 angel among their group, further confusing him as to why members of all 3 factions were in one place. He would need to look into that soon, since if the three biblical factions had allied together, then that could only mean trouble for everyone else. Or it could be the prelude to war. There was no way the ego of all three factions could work together in an effective manner, and eventually someone would do something to piss the other two off and war would be the end result. It would be funny to watch if nothing else. Kurama then turned to the throne and was confused by what he saw. The throne was the symbol of the ruler of Kyoto, and specifically, the Kyoto Yukai faction. Furthermore, it was where the ley lines running through Kyoto merged, meaning it was where the ruler was most powerful. Kurama remembered many a time where he saw Yusaka sitting on the throne settling this or that dispute. It had been boring as all hell and he fell asleep most of the time, something which had pissed Yusaka off fiercely. Yet instead of his beautiful wife sitting on the throne, a golden-haired girl that looked like a miniature Yusaka was sitting on it. Kurama vanished from his spot, reappearing in front of Kuno while leaning over her, looking at her through narrowed eyes. Kuno stared back at him unflinchingly, even if inside she was slightly scared. She hadn't even seen him move. Her guests were thinking the same thing, inwardly wondering how fast he was, since not even Seraphol or Azazel had been able to completely follow his movements. Kurama studied Kuno intensely and even pinched her cheeks slightly, getting Kuno to whine in complaint before he let her go. The fox lady seemed to be about to step forward angrily when the old Tengu stopped her, shaking his head. Kurama poked her a bit more before he finally spoke. "Yusaka. Why the fuck are you a child? How long was I gone? Wait, that doesn't make any sense. Did I come back in time or something?" Everyone in the hall could only sweat drop at Kurama's conclusion and wonder if perhaps he had hit his head to come to such a stupid conclusion. Meanwhile, Kurama was extremely confused and had a bad feeling growing in his gut. This girl looked very much like Yusaka from when they were children, which was why at first, he had thought she was her. However, not only did her getting younger not make any sense, but there were slight differences from the young Yusaka he remembered, so while she was not Yusaka, she was obviously related to her in some way. "I am not my M," started Kuno with a frown before she was interrupted. "Who are you?" asked Kurama rudely, no longer having the patience to deal with whoever this was. If she was here, then where was his wife, and why did she leave this little girl in her place? "I am Kuno, the daughter of Yusaka, the ruler of the Yukai living in Inner and Outer Kyoto. Now, I demand you to state who you are and the reason why you broke in here," Kuno requested haughtily. Kurama froze as the girl's words filtered into his brain, while beside her, the old Tengu paled as he realized how the male Kitsune would interpret it. After all, he hadn't known Yusaka was pregnant when he disappeared. "Kurama D," said the old Tengu, trying to head off the inevitable explosion. However, it was too late. "What?" yelled Kurama in rage, his power exploding off him and sending the fox lady and Tengu flying, and would have done the same to Kuno if she hadn't already been sitting. The Gremory group stiffened as they felt Kurama's hit them. Everyone other than Seraphol, Rosweiss and Azazel immediately began to struggle not to fall face first onto the floor, and even those three were sweating slightly. Rosweiss more than the two leaders. Their alarm grew stronger when his demonic power kept rising, entering the realm of the strongest of ultimate class and Satan class devils, and even then it showed no signs of stopping, growing exponentially. The younger devils and Soul Angel were in shock as they felt the male Yukai's power. Up until then, they had never felt such raw power before, and the only one they could compare it to was Loki. The idea of fighting someone of Loki's strength by themselves caused them to pale in fear. "That unfaithful bitch!" yelled Kurama in sheer rage and a healthy dose of hurt. He turned to the old Tengu with an angry look on his face. "Where is Yusaka? Where is my wife?" That caused everyone but the old Tengu and Kurama to pause in shock. Yusaka was his wife. Then didn't that mean To-san? Asked Kuno quietly. Kuno had never met her father, and whenever she asked her mother, she simply said he had went somewhere and would return someday. Yet despite her words, Kuno could see how sad her mother was whenever she asked, so she had simply thought had died or left them. Kurama turned at her cry and was about to lash out at her when he froze. From Kuno's perspective, she saw a look of fear and disgust cross his face before it became blank once more, and he lowered the hand that was about to lash out at her. "I am not your father," Kurama gritted out softly yet firmly, his hands turning into fists. "So don't call me that." He turned once more to the old Tengu with a glare. "Where is my wife, Tengu?" Kuna's eyes started to tear from the hurtful rejection from her father. She didn't understand what he meant and so thought he was rejecting her as his child, causing her heart to break at the thought of her own father not loving her. The old Tengu looked at Kuno, whose eyes had started to tear slightly, before turning back to the still angry Kurama. "Yusaka Haim has been kidnapped. Kurama Dono. She had been on her way to meet with a messenger from Mount Meru when she was attacked. From our own investigation as well as our allies' information, We believe the newly revealed Chaos Brigade is behind it. If true, she could be in great danger. Your help will be greatly appreciated in rescuing her, Kurama Dono." Kurama fell quiet at that, processing the information. It looked as if Yusaka needed him to save her beautiful hide just like during the Civil War. Well, he'd do just that and have a little talk with his wife about her unfaithfulness. Kurama turned to Kuno and rather than say anything, he just grabbed her by the back of her kimono, picked her up gently and placed her beside the throne, holding back the desire to throw her aside roughly. While he was sure she wasn't his child, he wouldn't lash out at her when it was no fault of hers. She had no control over who her parents were and didn't deserve his anger. He would not become his father. Once that was done, he sat himself on the throne, feeling quite proud of himself for some reason. Despite his hate of politics, had always wanted to sit on the throne to lord the fact that a half-breed was the new emperor over those idiotic blood purists. Speaking of idiots who put way too much respect in blood, Kurama's eyes fell on the three factions' ambassadors with distrusting eyes. "So," said Kurama blandly, "you all just happened to be in the area when my wife was kidnapped. Very coincidental." Seraphal and Azazel had neutral looks on their faces at his thinly veiled accusation, already having expected it since that very same thinking was what had Issei attacked earlier by Kuno and her guards. The others, however, were not as diplomatic and were about to protest before the old Tengu spoke. "Kurama Dono," said the old Tengu anxiously, "our new allies have already explained to us that they were not behind Yusaka's kidnapping." Kurama snorted, "Not directly, maybe, but everyone knows that the new Satans and Azazel are such terrible rulers that their people does whatever they want under their noses and they're never aware of it until afterwards, and when they are, they claim it wasn't their fault, like if their lack of ability to properly control their people doesn't make them just as guilty. For all we know, devils and fallen angels could be involved and they wouldn't even be aware." Both Seraphal and Azazel twitched at the insult, but the recent actions of both Diodora Astaroth and Kokabiel stopped from saying anything. The former especially had almost destroyed the treaty between heaven and the underworld when word of Diodora's actions reached the former. It had taken much talking and some concessions on their part to appease Michael. While the Archangel was usually calm and peaceful, he had been utterly furious that not only had Diodora been targeting holy maidens, but that he took pleasure in breaking them both mentally and spiritually. Needless to say, the Astaroth clan had suffered greatly as repercussion from Diodora's actions. And the less said about Azazel's hands-off approach to ruling the Grigori, the better. Kurama hid a smile as his ability to sense negative emotions told him he'd hit the nail in the head. It seemed all was not well in their respective factions if their fear of someone from their factions being involved was any indication. Kurama, of course, knew about the Chaos Brigade. They'd been around in the shadows for over a century at least from what had discovered. Kurama never quite figured out whether they had a hand in the Yukai Civil War. There were signs that they had approached Yusaka's father, but whether he had accepted their help or not was unknown. It had become moot when Yusaka's father died anyway, so he had let it go. However, that wasn't important right now. What was important was establishing whether or not any of the biblical factions was involved in Yusaka's kidnapping. He didn't doubt the Chaos Brigade was the one who did the actual kidnapping. But that didn't mean they hadn't been backed by someone from one of their factions. There had always been tension between the Shinto pantheon and the biblical factions, especially since the latter had the audacity to spread their religion onto their shores. If it hadn't been for the treaty that forbid the pantheons from going to war with each other or getting involved in each other's affairs, he had no doubt that Amaterasu would have scorched Japan clean of their presence. She had never liked them much. For that reason, it wasn't impossible that someone from their factions had secretly backed the Chaos Brigade into their current actions of kidnapping Yusaka. For all their disagreements and his current anger at her perceived infidelity, Kurama had to admit that she was a great leader and had done much to help their faction since her rise to power. Getting rid of her would cripple them greatly. Furthermore, the fact that they hadn't killed her meant they knew about her importance to maintaining Kyoto's ley lines, so whoever kidnapped her wanted her out of the way but not dead since Kuno wasn't yet old enough to maintain the flow of ki from the ley lines. But she was young enough to be manipulated. Anyone who was angry at Yusaka's actions as leader but knew about her importance to maintaining the ley lines could have ample reason to have her kidnapped. It would take her out of the picture while not endangering Kyoto's balance with the bonus of leaving Kuno open to manipulation. The fact that she allowed more than one messenger from a different faction to enter the inner capital showed how easily the young girl could be convinced to do another's bidding. There was a reason no more than one messenger was allowed at a time. It was a security measure meant to protect both the current leader and the Yukai who hide within the inner capital from any attempt at invasion. Most of the Yukai who lived in the inner capital weren't very strong and so depended on both the current emperor, empress and the inner capital barriers for protection. By allowing so many powerful non-Yukai into the inner capital, Kuno had risked the lives of those she was supposed to protect if by chance they had turned hostile. 1. The guards might have been able to push out of the inner capital. But all of them. If they turned hostile, especially with Yusaka missing and none of the generals in residence, there would be no one around to stop them. But back to the matter at hand. Kurama focused back on the group to see the short blonde-haired and brown-haired reincarnated devils seemed angry at his words. Good. People always revealed more in anger, he knew from experience. You can't speak that way to Sarafal-sama, said the blonde-haired one angrily as he stood up. Kurama glared at the devil and unleashed a short blast of killing intent, causing the young man to fall back to his knees, white as a sheet. Ignoring him once more, Kurama turned back to the faction's leaders. So? Asked Kurama while leaning back on the throne and looking at them in contempt. Am I wrong? Can you tell me absolute certainty that no one from either of your factions may have had a hand in this, using the Chaos Brigade as a tool to get what they wanted? Azazel cleared his throat and spoke. No, we cannot. We're ashamed to say that members of both our factions are counted among the Chaos Brigade, so it is completely possible that either devils or fallen angels are involved. However, we are willing to help rescue your wife, and if anyone from either of our factions is involved, we're willing to make up for it. Kurama cocked an eyebrow at his words, internally surprised they'd be willing to admit to possibly being in the wrong and even willing to make up for it. However, he still didn't trust them, especially not with his wife's life. He would rescue her himself and then investigate whether there was any link between her kidnapping and the biblical factions. It couldn't be a coincidence that they were in Kyoto just a few days after her kidnapping. A trip to Kyoto, especially asking for permission from Yusaka to be able to enter the city, would have taken a few weeks at least. Therefore, either they were involved with her kidnapping somehow or the kidnappers purposefully chose to kidnap Yusaka knowing they were arriving in the city soon. Either way, this had to be handled internally, both to keep them out of the way if they're involved and to able to investigate any connection between them and the kidnapping. If they got involved, it would muddy the waters, and if Kurama investigated them afterwards, it could result into a political falling out. He couldn't risk that. While he had no problems with putting the three factions in their place, he had no idea as to the current state of the Kyoto Yukai faction. Yusaka had been pushing to disband their army, and if the stupid woman had actually managed it, that meant they were basically defenseless. He had to assess the state of the faction before making any moves. Perhaps, stated Kurama neutrally, however, due to the ambiguity regarding your possible connection to my wife's kidnapping, I am going to have deny your offer of assistance. We will handle this internally. Afterwards, you may speak with my wife about any peace treaty between our factions. Of course, Kurama's glowed red with rage, only after I've had a few words with her first. At that, Issei had to speak. Hey, wait a minute. We here to help Kuno-chan and rescue Onisama. He didn't want to leave just like that. He wanted to see massive-breasted Miko in person. That wasn't the only reason though. He also wanted to help the cute Kitsune girl, but it was the one that stood out the most. Ha, please, the Opie dragon only wanted a reward. Azazel snickered a little as a joke. Xenovia, Asia and Irina were nodding their heads and gave their jabs as well. Reward, muttered Kurama in thought before it clicked. Unfortunately for them, none of them knew that despite his current anger at his wife, Kurama hated comments like that about his wife. Whenever some upstart noble punk flirted with his wife in social gatherings, he always punched them out regardless of who they were. Which might have been part of the reason his wife banned him from formal gatherings now that he thought about it. But that combined with the belief that his wife had been unfaithful to him and her whispered derogatory nickname among the more anti-devil Yukai of Devil's Whore, made Kurama's mind instantly go to the worst, and correct, possible conclusion of what this little devil wanted as a reward. I'll fucking kill you, roared Kurama after understanding what the fallen angel had meant and disappeared from his seat in a flash of red. Seraphal and Azazel barely tracked the redhead's movement and intercepted as fast as they could, which barely saved the pervert from a most gruesome death. A boom exploded from the collisions as the three combatants flipped back to disengage. Both Seraphal and Azazel felt their arms pulsated in pain from the strength of the hit. Worse yet, they could tell he had been holding back. Kurama clenched his fist from the opposite side, checking the hand, and realized these two had enough strength to block his attack even if he had been holding back some. Well, he had been looking for a way to test out his new powers. What better test dummies than these two? You guys get out of here. Now, Azazel ordered as he realized his mistake. In hindsight, making perverted comments about Amon's wife in front of the man himself was probably not the best idea. I wonder how I match up against the great Azazel and Leviathan with my new powers, Kurama said with a smile as his body was coated with flickering with reddish aura. Yuki and chakra propagated through his limbs as his eyes became sharper. Now capable of following speeds faster than even the speed of light easily, He also tapped into this world's natural energy, using it to enhance his already considerable speed and strength. Please wait. Kurama Dono, the Tengu beseeched desperately, but it was too late. Kurama disappeared in a red flash and smashed his fist full strength, capable of shattering multiple buildings to rubble with ease, right into Azazel's solar plexus before the man realized what had just happened. Azazel might have been able to block the strike if he wasn't so stunned at the speed that Kurama was displaying. Even with his eyes right on Kurama the entire time, he had barely made out his movements. As it was, Azazel felt several of his ribs crack under the blow, causing him to gasp in pain. Seraphal's eyes widened. She couldn't track the man at all. It was less like high-speed movement and more like teleporting from one point to another instantly. What kind of ability was that? Also, what this strange aura around him? It seemed to become thicker each passing second. Senjutsu, cried out Seraphal in alarm. Senjutsu, natural energy. Kurama was intimately knowledgeable of its capabilities from his time with Naruto. In their later years, they had mastered the usage of gathering natural energy, mixing it with Kurama's demonic chakra and Naruto's own chakra, all while in the midst of combat. Back then, Kurama would handle the flow and mixing of the differing chakras to make sure it was never too much or too little, so it was easy for him to do it now in his new, old form. Every planet with life on it has natural energy. The more natural energy, the more life grows on the planet. The more life, the more natural energy is created. It becomes a loop that culminates in stuff like the God Tree. Kurama suspected that if Kagaya had never eaten the chakra fruit, then it may have germinated into the various god-like beings present in Kurama's home dimension, though that was just speculation on his part. The point was that Kurama had a lot of experience wielding senjutsu and in fact found its calming effect counteracted his own inherently malicious demonic chakra quite well, so as he gathered the natural energy of this world, he expected it to be no different than the hundreds of times had done it before. However, he had overlooked one crucial fact. This was not the elemental nations. Despite beings like the Biju being called demons, no true demons had ever come into existence. The only possibly true demon had been Morio, and he had been from another world and not actually born there. Therefore, it could be said that the elemental nations did not have true demonic beings of its own. This was in stark contrast to the DxD universe, where demonic beings had come into existence fairly early on in its creation, not counting beings like Lucifer falling from grace and creating devils. All this corrupted the natural energy of the planet with the demonic energy of the demons. The Great War only made it worse, the demonic and divine powers clashing, causing an incredible imbalance in the natural energy of the planet that was still felt to this. To make things even worse, the elemental nations did not have a primordial goddess that merged with the planet itself, becoming the very embodiment of the earth. It was for this reason that the natural energy of the elemental nations had no true will of its own, being little more than free energy than anyone with the correct training can use. Sure, there were side effects if you used it incorrectly, but that was simply from using without the proper training, like any other advanced ability, not an inherent danger of the natural energy itself. The DxD universe did that have all that. However, this gave natural energy not only a will in the form of Gaia, but also the capability to feel negative emotions such as fear, anger, and more importantly, hatred. Kurama was caught off guard when a wave of sheer hatred hit him as he absorbed the world's natural energy. Having opened his empathetic abilities expecting to be hit by the calming effect of senjutsu, he was completely unprepared for sheer wave of negative emotions that came with this world's natural energy. If Kurama hadn't opened his empathetic abilities to maximum in preparation to using senjutsu, then he would have no doubt easily have fought off the influence of the world's hatred. He had been using his ability to sense negative emotions for millennia, and while he had been greatly affected by the negative emotions when he was young, he had completely mastered centuries ago. However, having not expected the world's hatred and with his ability to sense negative emotions working against him combined with his already enraged mindset, he could do nothing but give into both the world's hatred and his own. Kurama's sight and eyes turned blood red as he gave into his rage and bloodlust as he viciously attacked both Azazel and Seraphal. The former had been knocked away from a vicious backhand following the initial punch, and now Seraphal was alone in trying to hold off the enraged Biju. Something anyone from the elemental nations could have told you was no easy task. To make things worse, his own demonic chakra had reacted to his rage and activated, causing a cloak of crimson chakra to cover him, enhancing his already monstrous strength and speed. Seraphal dodged Kurama's fist, only for the demonic chakra shroud to seemingly move on its own and lash out at her. She barely put up her arms in time to block and held in a cry of pain as not only did the blow hit hard enough to slightly fracture one of her arm bones, but the demonic chakra burned her where it touched. Seraphal jumped back to escape any further attack while absently using her ice magic to cool down the burns from the demonic energy. Part of her wondered why it seemed so corrosive to her. she could sense that whatever it was, the energy was demonic in nature if not origin, so why didn't her being a devil give some kind of resistance to it? Little did she know that this wasn't normal demonic energy which would have given her a slight resistance to its corrosive effects. This was demonic chakra that was originally a piece of the first primordial of the elemental nations. It was fundamentally different from any current form of demonic energy, and there was currently no being other than Kurama who could even wield it without suffering from its negative side effects. It was lucky her own demonic power was so strong and that the shroud wasn't more concentrated due to Kurama's internal struggle. If it wasn't for that, the demonic chakra would have already invaded her internal pathways and burned them from the inside out. The enraged Kurama roared and chased after her, his demonic energy and rage spiking at the fact that his target was still alive. Meanwhile, Azazel was finishing receiving healing from Asia from the previous attack which had broken quite a few of his ribs. Okay. Thank you Asia, but you guys need to get away from here. This fight is beyond you guys. Before they could protest, Azazel jumped into the fight to aid Seraphal, who was doing worse and worse against Kurama. At first, she could hold her own, but as the Senjutsu's hatred started to dominate his mind, he became more and more animalistic, making his fighting style more and more unpredictable. It didn't help that his power, already at high-level ultimate class, was climbing higher and higher as time passed with no signs of stopping. Seraphal dodged his fist once more only for his chakra cloak to lash out and smack her into the ground, creating a crater where she landed and causing the area to shake. Seraphal grunted at the powerful blow, but still, she could handle it. If this kept up, even with Azazel's help they would eventually lose. As it was, she couldn't go on the offense, and with his power being seemingly endless, that path would openly lead to one conclusion. While she could easily handle his strength, at least at his current level, it was his speed that forced her to be on the defensive. Even from her place in the crater she could see Azazel attempt to attack him from behind, only for Kurama to disappear in a red flash and instantly appear behind Azazel, lashing out with a clawing attack like an animal that Azazel barely dodged. It was less like speed and more like he was simply teleporting from place to place, leaving them no chance to locate his new position before he lashed out. As it was only the fact that he seemed to have lost his cognitive thinking due to Senjutsu's hatred that allowed to stay alive. While it made his fighting style more unpredictable in some ways, it also made his patterns of attack much more predictable in others. Taking a deep breath, Seraphal jumped back into the fray. Back among the audience, the bystanders could only watch in shock at the level of the fight before them. Is this a fight between ultimate class beings? Asked Issei in shock. Sure. He may have fought beings around their level before, Loki and Kokabiel being prime examples, but those fights had always ended with them using some outside force to close the gap between their respective power levels, either through Issei's boost and transfer technique, Valis interference, or Thor's hammer. They had never actually watched a fight between two beings of that level before. It was as awe-inspiring as it was terrifying. They were destroying the area around them as they fought, and even their clashes produced visible shockwaves in the air. They hadn't even used any magic or special attack. It was nothing but pure speed and strength, and the thought of the cute little Mao being that strong and fast really drove home that she was a Mao more than anything before. As it was only Arasoswise putting a barrier around them that stopped them from being affected both by the tremendous power they were putting off as well as the shockwaves caused by their clashes. Beside him, Irina was also in awe of the strength shown as well, with a healthy dose of fear. On one hand she was proud that an angel could become that strong, and it gave her an insight into how strong Michael must be since he was considered much stronger than Azazel. It also gave her hope to someday be that strong herself so she wouldn't be left behind by Issei and his friends who seemed to grow by leaps and bounds. On the other hand, it gave her a chilling look as to how the Great War must have looked like in its prime. A time when beings of this power clashed almost every day, destroying everything around them in their clashes without any regard to who suffered. Even now she could see normal yokai running in terror from the fight, as well as several of them being injured from the collateral damage caused by the fight. Despite this, the fight showed no sign of slowing down and even seemed to raising to higher levels as their punches and movements created larger and larger shockwaves. Near the Gremory group, the old Tengu stood with Kuno being held protectively by the Kitsune lady, the former desperately trying to stop this fight. Governor Dono. Mao Dono. Kurama Dono. Please stop fighting. He needed to stop this before it became lethal, possibly ruining any chance of peace between their respective factions. Yasaka-sama might want peace between their factions, but if she found out that her husband, who had been missing for years, was hurt or killed by the Governor General and the Leviathan Mao, any chance for it would quickly disappear. While Azazel and Seraphal were more than willing to do so, since they were guests after all, they couldn't take their attention off Kurama for a second. If they did, they could actually die. As it was, it took all their concentration to avoid his increasingly random, but no less deadly attacks every time he seemed to teleport from place to place. "This is very bad," mumbled Azazel as he avoided yet another strike from the increasingly angry redhead. Seraphal tried to take advantage to launch a punch of her own only for Kurama to block it easily with one hand, grip her fist and then brutally kneeing her. He would have done worse if Azazel hadn't interfered, trying to punch him from behind, which only caused Kurama to disappear in another red flash. Seraphal quickly recovered and winced slightly in pain from the brutal knee. Levi Tan thinks he's only getting stronger. Azazel-kun, that last attack had cracked a few ribs and she used ice over her abdomen to try and prevent it from getting worse. "I think it might be Tuki," said Azazel lowly as they took advantage of the slight lull in the fight. "If it is, we have to finish this before he gets too strong." Tuki increased a user's attack speed and strength tremendously and continued to do so long as the user had the life force and willpower. And as the fight continued, neither seemed to drop any noticeable amount. If anything, they seemed to only increase, which unfortunately caused his rage, battle spirit and bloodlust to increase as well. It was painfully obvious he had given into the world's hatred from using senjutsu, and if this continued, he would kill not only them but everyone around him until he ran out of power, and considering they could sense no end of his power in sight, that might take very long time. They needed to stop holding back and switch battle tactics. Seraphal released her devil wings, causing her power in the air around her to start to freeze. Near her, Azazel also released his 12 black wings, causing his angelic power to peak. The release of both their powers caused the area to shake slightly and instantly drew the now near animalistic Kurama's attention. As they expected, he disappeared in a red flash and appeared above Azazel with an axe kick. Instantly, Seraphal reacted, freezing the limb and attempting to freeze him entirely so Azazel could stab him non-lethally with a light spear. The idea was that the pain from the wound would break him from senjutsu's trance and they could talk him down. However, Kurama instantly disappeared in another red flash before the ice spread farther than his leg. Appearing hovering nearby, he growled and the ice on his legs seemed to melt as his demonic chakra and yoki seemed to melt it off. That posed a problem. If his power could melt Seraphal's ice, she would need to flash freeze him all at once in order to hold him still long enough. She hesitated since it could hurt him badly if she froze too much, but from what she had seen, he would survive. The three clashed a few more times, but it seemed that even in his current state, Kurama seemed to sense Seraphal as the bigger threat and focused on her, not giving her time to freeze him. Azazel's interference kept her from being taken out of the fight, but as time passed, the fight only further favored Kurama. Eventually, Kurama was broken out of his trance by an outside element. Seraphal and Azazel had been trying to box Kurama in for a while now, hoping to stop him from teleporting when a crimson beam lashed out, hitting Kurama from behind and throwing him into some nearby buildings. Both faction leaders turned to see a scale-mailed Issei with a hand outstretched where he had thrown a dragon shot. It hadn't been hard to see what the two had been planning, and seeing that Kurama seemed to have completely forgotten about them in his anger, Issei took advantage to hit him when his back was turned, hoping to take him out of the fight with one hit. "I thought I told you guys to get out of here, but I guess I should be glad you didn't listen. Good job, pervert," said Azazel with a small smile while regaining his breath. That fight took more out him than he thought. He was seriously out of shape if he had to catch his breath from such a, relatively, short fight. Maybe he should get back into shape, especially with the Chaos Brigade running around. Near him, Seraphal was also breathing slightly deeper and was thinking much the same. Everyone turned when they heard the rubble where Kurama landed moving and the man in question rising out of the rubble without a single scratch on him. Only a few scuff marks on his clothes showed where the dragon shot landed. However, his eyes were no longer glowing red from his demonic chakra and senjutsu-induced rage, showing they had succeeded in breaking him out of it. Azazel quickly tried to take advantage to plead his case. "Please, Kurama Dono. I meant no offense, we were only joking around." Meanwhile, Kurama shook his head as the last of the senjutsu-induced anger left him. He had been completely caught off guard by the hatred in the world's natural energy, and it had turned him into a berserker. He was painfully reminded that this wasn't his world and there were stark differences between the two. He would have to refrain from senjutsu until he discovered the differences. Thinking Kurama's silence meant a refusal to accept Azazel's apology, Seraphal tried her hand. "Kuro-tan, we should be fighting. We should help each other and work together to find Yusaka-chan." That got Kurama's attention, but not the positive kind. "Help? Excuse me?" He scoffed derisively. "No thank you, we don't need your kind's help. We would be better asking Izanami for help than your factions. At least that way when we're fucked from behind, we'll be expecting it." He had almost forgotten the sheer arrogance of the three biblical factions, thinking the world revolved around them, even with their pathetic, third-rate god dead. They still think themselves the most important factions in the world and that they had the right to stick their noses in everything. Serafal frowned at his response and tried to placate him. That's not what I meant, we really do just want to he. Enough. Yelled Kurama angrily before glaring at the two faction leaders, Angel, Fallen and Devils. Do you have any idea how much I hate your fucking races? You start a childish, worthless war which causes thousands of my kind to die despite having nothing to do with it all because of one brat's temper tantrum. You almost destroyed the world in your fucking war. Yet instead of dying off along with your god, you invent a slave system to enslave other races to do your bidding, treating them like third-class citizens, and when they dare to rebel against their treatment, they're executed for daring to fight against their masters. Oh, I know what you're going to say. Cut off Kurama when Serafal moved to speak. It's to replace our losses in the war. That's bullshit. If you needed to do that, all you needed to do was approach one of the many fertility goddesses in the world and ask for their blessing. It would have increased your fertility rate and you could have easily regained your population the normal way by now. But no, said Kurama with a sneer, that's not the devil way. Why create when you can take? Why do things the right and slow way when you can have what you want quickly even if it means enslaving others? That's the devil way, take, destroy, corrupt. What's the excuse your kind always gives? Oh right, I am a devil, Kurama scoffed and glared at the wincing Serafal, who remembered many times her fellow devils had given that very excuse for their less than honorable actions. If that's the case, then you all are abominations who should have never have been born in the first place. Serafal frowned at his words and exchanged glances with Azazel, who was also frowning. It seemed that Yusaka's husband had a deep, abiding hatred of their factions and any chance of a treaty between them was impossible with him on the throne. Perhaps when Yusaka returned, they could try again, but as it was, any further attempts at extending an olive branch would only get the branch ripped out of their hands and used to beat them over the head with. Before they could speak, another did so first. That's not true, yelled Issei, which caused Kurama's glare to turn to him. The force of the glare caused Issei to pause and gulp, but he continued on. Bucko isn't like that at all. She may be prideful at times, but she's the most kind and caring person I know. Despite me being weak, she still accepted me and supports me. She's nothing like what you said. Kurama only scoffed at the idiot's naivety. Please. The only reason she bothered to resurrect you in the first place was because of your sacred gear. If it wasn't for that, she wouldn't have bothered. While she may have come to care for you now, it doesn't change the fact that the basis of your relationship was on your sacred gear. If you never had that, then you would still be nothing more than a normal human who wasn't worth her time. And even if she does treat you right, continued Kurama with anger in his voice, can you honestly tell me that every single devil you've ever met treats their peerage right? Issei was about to argue when he remembered Diodora Astaroth and the revelation of not only what he did to Asia but what he had been doing to over a dozen nuns in his life. The memory of the broken looks on the faces of his peerage members still haunted him. They had been taken for therapy to see if they could help them, but so far, no progress had been made. Kurama smirked as he saw the complicated expressions crossing Issei's face. You see? That kind of treatment isn't the exception but rather the norm, and it's all because the Mao, here he turned to Serafal with a sneer, are too weak and pathetic to do anything to stop that kind of treatment. You all were lucky to have a master who treated you correctly. You could have just as easily have been turned into devils by someone much, much worse. Issei flinched as he remembered Diodora's plan for Asia and how if he hadn't been there, she would have been just as broken as the rest of Diodora's peerage. The thought of cute, little Asia being turned into the hollow shell the others were shook something deep inside him. Kurama's smirk widened when he saw the effect his words had on the young devil. There was a story there, and while he might deny it all he wants, deep inside he could see Kurama's words had some standing and it left him deeply confused and uncertain. Azazel looked at Issei with a frown and made a note to have a talk with him later before tuning back to Kurama. Regardless of your feelings, I must insist that we help. The Chaos Brigade is more dangerous than you know and you can't take them on by yourself. Kurama's eyes narrowed at his words even as his power spiked in response to his anger. The arrogance of your factions rears its head once more. I guess I am going to have to show you your place. Kurama's power rose dramatically, far surpassing ultimate class territory and approaching god class. Serafal and Azazel rose their own power in response, and while much weaker than Kurama's, they prepared themselves for the coming fight. The sudden power increase Alcin broke Issei out of his thoughts and the Gremory group prepared themselves to fight alongside their teachers. Seeing this, Azazel yelled at them, "Get out of here, kids, this is way out of your league." "No way, Azazel-sensei," yelled Issei as his scale mail glinted in the sun, "we can beat him if we work together." "Kids these days, no respect for your elders," grumbled Azazel as he refocused back on Kurama. Kurama's power had slowly concentrated back into him, forming a thin layer of crimson energy over his skin. The fact he managed to control and condense such a large amount of energy without lowering its output caused Seraphol and Azazel to gulp as they realized they might be seriously out of their league right now. Suddenly, both Azazel and Seraphol gasped in agony as Kurama appeared between them, punching them so hard that they felt their rib cages shatter. Surprised, they noticed the image of Kurama they had been looking at fade away, revealing itself to be an after-image. "Yeah," said the real Kurama, still holding them up with his fist, "I am that fast." Any response or reaction they could have had was cut off when two black orbs appeared inside Kurama's now open hands and blasted them into the air. Once they reached high enough, the orbs exploded with tremendous force, knocking them instantly unconscious, causing them to crash into the ground not far away. Kurama grunted as he sensed they were still alive. He had purposefully made the Bijudama weak enough so while it would knock them out, it wouldn't kill them. While he didn't care about them at all, he had to focus on finding his wife, and he couldn't do that if he also had to worry about the response for their murder by their factions. Meanwhile, the Gremory group was in shock at seeing their teachers get taken out with what amounted to one hit each. To see two people who were touted for their strength get taken out like they were nothing seriously undermined their confidence. Despite that, Issei gathered what confidence he had left and charged at Kurama with Xenovia, Irina and Kiba following behind him and Rosweiss starting to gather her energy for her magic. Kurama scoffed at their charge and spoke just loud enough for them to hear, "Naive, you are only as strong as your weakest link." With that, he disappeared in a red flash, appearing before a startled Asia with his hand in a knife shape heading toward her heart. Rule 1. Always take out the healer first, thought Kurama viciously. Just before he could go through with it, a superimposed image of a younger Naruto took Asia's place, causing him to hesitate. Quickly, Kurama changed his plan to rip through Asia's heart with his hand into a fist that, while still brutal, was now non-lethal. Asia instantly fell unconscious from the brutal punch, taking her out of the fight. Stupid brat, thought Kurama in slight anger and a hint of fondness as he saw a younger Naruto in the blonde blue-eyed young nun, making me soft. Oh well. I guess killing them would cause more trouble than it's worth, so I'll settle for teaching them a lesson. Asia, yelled a now furious Issei as he switched directions and tried to rush Kurama from behind. Only for Kurama to disappear from his spot and appear in the air beside Issei with his right leg, which was now glowing with red energy, pulled back. While emotions give you a boost, never let them dictate your actions in combat. With that, Kurama kicked Issei in the head, instantly shattering his scale mail and sending him crashing into a nearby building, seemingly taking him out of the fight as well. Kurama landed and easily dodged a slash from the blonde-haired kid with a bored look in his eyes. He continued to do so as the other, much more slower ones approached and Rosweiss took an unconscious Asia out of the range of the fight. Kurama sneered as he dodged the brat's attacks with ease. Once he was bored with that, he concentrated his demonic chakra into his right hand where he created a solid Odachi sword made of his Biju energy and used it to impale Kiba through the stomach. As Kiba yelled in pain both from the wound and the demonic energy burning his insides, Kurama sneered at the boy. What the hell was that? This is a fight, not a movie choreography. Leave the flashy crap for the movies. In a fight, the only goal is to kill your enemy, not show off how good your swordsmanship looks. Kiba glared and called on his sacred gear and summoned a large amount of swords beneath Kurama's feet. Kurama rolled his eyes and channeled his energy into the floor directly beneath him, preventing swords from forming beneath him. The end result was swords forming around him but none coming close to hurting him. A waste of energy that could have been used for other tactics, sneered Kurama. Furthermore, Kurama quickly ripped a copy of Holy Eraser from the ground with his free hand and used it to block Irina's light sword. The attributes of the sword caused her holy energy to be absorbed into it, leaving Irina defenseless. Your swords can be used against your allies, finished Kurama before tossing Kiba aside and into a wall where he collapsed unconscious. At the same time, Kurama slashed Irina from her left hip to her right shoulder. A spray of blood came from the wound, covering Kurama in her blood though he looked unbothered by it. As for you, said a dismissive Kurama, angels with less than 6 wings have no place on the battlefield. Come back when you are actually worth acknowledging. Kurama then raised a single finger, blocking Durandal from hitting him in the head from a furious Xenovia. Kurama then looked at the blade before looking at the now shocked former exorcist. And you are the most pathetic of the bunch, said Kurama condescendingly. Durandal can destroy anything. The fact I can stop it with one finger shows your weakness, not the swords. You try to hold back the sword's power instead of unleashing it. Kurama sneered. You will never be able to wield this sword properly until you embrace the true concept of destruction. Kurama then disappeared in a red flash before appearing behind a still shocked Xenovia. Instantly a large cut appeared on Xenovia's back that mirrored the one on Irina's. causing blood to spray from it as well before Xenovia collapsed from the pain. "And then there was one," said Kurama before turning to the now just returning Rosweiss, who looked on in shock at how quickly her friends had been taken out. Now that he focused on her, Kurama blinked in shock. "Rosweiss?" asked Kurama in shock. "Little Rosie?" Indeed, now that he had calmed down and focused on her, he recognized the energy signature of the little girl he knew years ago when he was traveling the world. Last time he saw her she was just a cute 9-year-old who blushed and stuttered whenever she looked at him. Wow. Kurama's eyes roved up and down Rosweiss's very mature body with a leer, causing said girl to blush deeply. "You've grown up quite nicely." Rosweiss' blush deepened and she stuttered slightly despite the circumstances. She had recognized Kurama the moment he appeared as the man who visited her family when she was young. However, she hadn't thought he would recognize her after so many years since seeing each other. She had wondered why he stopped visiting all those years ago and was surprised to see him again. To tell the truth, he had been her first crush despite her young age, her bad boy persona and attitude attracting the, even then, bookish and shy girl immensely. Rosweiss broke out of her blush when she reminded herself that this same man just took out her friends, Amao and Azazel, with ease, and they were currently fighting. She felt sick with unease as she looked to see how badly injured her friends were. Kurama noticed where her attention was and was quick to reassure her. "Don't worry, they'll be fine, heavily injured but not lethal once they get medical attention. I wasn't aiming to kill them." That seemed to reassure Rosweiss, but she tensed when she saw Kurama's smirk. "Now little Rosie," said Kurama with a smirk, "let's see how much you've grown in other ways." Rosweiss quickly summoned a magical circle at his words and unleashed her magic on him. Kurama hummed as he easily dodged the gouts of every element including ice, fire, water, lightning, wind, thunder, light and explosive-based magic. The wide variety of magic types was quite impressive and he could tell that her magic circle was self-made and quite complex. The little girl had grown up to be quite strong. However, Kurama disappeared in a flash of red, only to appear behind Rosweiss's magic circle and in front of a shocked Rosweiss. "You have a large variety of magics, but like all jack of all trades, you've mastered none. Never move on to a new skill or type of magic until you've mastered every aspect of the previous." With that, Kurama put a finger on the still shocked Rosweiss's forehead and channeled his energy in a specific pattern. A small seal temporarily appeared on Rosweiss's forehead before she instantly fell asleep, falling into a ready Kurama's arms. Kurama had a small smile on his face as he saw how cute a sleeping Rosweiss looked. "Still, not bad, Rosie, you've grown quite strong." The smile dropped off his face as he turned and used his right hand to backhand a red beam of energy away from him, where it crashed into the floor behind and to the right of him. Kurama growled at the standing Issei who, while no longer having scale mail, still had his gauntlet on his left hand from his dragon shot. Kurama growled at the fact that the brat apparently was willing to hurt Rosweiss to get him. Raising his anger at the apparently backstabbing move, of course, Issei hadn't attacked thinking of hurting Rosweiss. From where he was standing, he hadn't seen that Rosweiss was only asleep and thought Kurama had killed her, which caused him to lash out. It was only when Kurama gently placed her on the floor that he saw that she was just asleep and caused him to cringe as he realized he had inadvertently put her in danger with his attack. Kurama knew none of this and only growled at what he perceived to be his cowardly attack and decided to teach the brat a lesson. Kurama disappeared in a red flash and appeared before Issei, surprising the boy. Before he could react, Kurama slammed his hand in a claw shape, each finger glowing a different color, into Issei's abdomen. "5 elements seal," yelled Kurama as he slammed his hand into the boy. Kurama smirked as he felt the seal take effect and seal away the boy's sacred gear, causing the boy to fall unconscious for real this time. The 5 elements was an expert-level seal that allowed the user to seal away an internal source of energy of the one it was applied to. What it sealed away was up to the user and it was quite flexible. The best thing was that unless the counter seal was applied, it was permanent, meaning that unless Kurama decided to unseal him, the boy would never be able to use his sacred gear again. Kurama glared down at the boy, still angry at his perceived willingness to harm his comrades to get an advantage over him. He had thought the boy was similar to Naruto in some ways, but it is blatantly obvious he wasn't. Naruto would have never have risked or used one of his allies in such a way, and it angered Kurama to think he ever thought they were similar. Kurama was broken out of his angry thoughts when he heard the old Tengu call for Kuno and said girl appear standing between him and the unconscious Issei with her hands outstretched. "That's enough," said Kuno with a stutter and her knees slightly shaking but still clearly, "don't hurt them anymore." Kurama blinked at her words, which reminded him strongly of Yusaka's one time when Kurama attacked a pair of nobles who mocked his half-breed status, and underneath it, it brought back an old and bittersweet memory. A much younger Kurama was laying on the floor, his back a mess of red bleeding lines from his father's latest discipline session. Every time Kurama would fail to meet his expectations, his father would give him a special session in an attempt to toughen him up. In reality, it was just a way for the bitter man to unleash his frustrations on his seemingly weak son. The session would have gone on longer if it wasn't for the red-haired girl currently standing between him and his father, pointing a sword at the latter with an angry look on her face. "If you ever touch him again," yelled the 15-year-old Kitsune girl in a furious tone, "I swear I'll kill you. Do you hear me? I will kill you if you ever hurt him again." The man looked furious at her words. "You'd defy me? For him?" Kurama was brought out of the memory when Kuno answered, not realizing he had repeated his father's words. "Yes," said Kuno shyly with a few tears in her eyes but clear enough to be heard. "Please, To-san, don't hurt them anymore." A complicated expression crossed Kurama's face before he reached out to Kuno with a blank look, her courage failing her. Kuno closed her eyes, awaiting the blow she expected to come. Instead, she felt a hand land on her head and gently rub it. Opening her eyes, Kuno was shocked to see a smile on her father's face. The effect washed away the stern lines on his face and made him seem much more handsome and kind than before. "Such a crybaby. Just like your mother," said Kurama with a soft smile, "but, at least you stand up for what you believe in, even against those stronger than you, just like her." "And maybe," thought a treacherous part of Kurama's mind, "just like your aunt." Kurama clamped down on those thoughts in the hope that came from them, not willing to dwell on the possibility. Looking down at the wide-eyed little Kitsune girl, Kurama gently picked her up in his arms, causing said girl to smile and happily snuggle in his arms. Turning to the old Tengu, Kurama spoke, "Take them to infirmary to get treated. None of their wounds should be lethal if properly treated." He paused before reluctantly continuing, "Take them to the palace infirmary, it's closer." Seeing the destruction the fight had caused, Kurama added something else, "And take any injured bystanders as well. Anyone whose home was damaged in the fight can stay in the palace while it's repaired. Take the cost out of my personal accounts. I imagine they're still available?" The old Tengu was shocked at the generosity at both the devils and toward the general public but quickly nodded. "Yes, Kurama Dono, your accounts are still open. Yusaka Dono made sure that all your investments and accounts flourished in your absence and refrained from touching them in any way during your absence. You were quite a bit richer." Kurama absently nodded as he noticed Kuno had fallen asleep in his arms. "Good. Now it seems like all the excitement has tired the young princess out. Can direct me to her room?" The fox lady stepped forward and bowed, agreeing to do so while the old Tengu started directing the other yokai to take the injured devils and angels to the infirmary. Kurama started to follow behind the fox lady before pausing, getting the old Tengu's attention. "Also, gather the generals, tell them I've ordered to report themselves immediately." The old Tengu paused before nodding his head in agreement. "As you command, Kurama Dono." With that, Kurama nodded and followed the fox lady to Kuno's room, all the while trying not to think about how right it felt to hold Kuno in his arms like this and what it meant. It was about 2 hours since the fight and night had fallen. However, Kurama was not at the palace but standing in a small clearing not far from it, close enough to sense any ill intent directed toward anyone there as well as react accordingly but not too close to be stumbled upon. Kurama had used his large amount of seal knowledge to construct a barrier around the large clearing, both stopping anyone from stumbling into the clearing, sensing anything inside it and stopping any stray attacks from leaving and hurting anyone. This clearing would be his training ground while he attempted to get a grasp on his new capabilities. The recent fight showed that he had no knowledge as to his new limits and that needed to be rectified. For one thing, it was the first time in millennia that he had felt pain. In the elemental nations, he had been more of a mass of solidified chakra than an actual flesh and blood body. Pain in that form was more of sensing chakra in a certain area dispersing from an attack than actual pain. It was the surprise of feeling it more than anything that had broken him out of senjutsu-induced rage than any actual damage. It was just one of many things he would have to get used to again. Kurama was currently sitting cross-legged on the floor with his eyes closed as he drew in the natural energy, ready for the influx of negative emotions now. Kurama easily ignored them thanks to his iron will. Millennia of sensing negative emotions in the elemental nations had made him immune to being affected by them, and it was only the fact that he hadn't been expecting it that caused it to affect him. But now he could easily use it without it affecting him, as shown when he opened his eyes, a slit in each eye showing his sage mode being in effect. However, Kurama frowned when he realized something. The natural energy was different here. He didn't know if it was the wide variety energies here, the presence of devils or event he effects of the Great War, but the natural energy seemed polluted somehow. It wasn't as pure as the elemental nations, which caused its effects to be noticeably weaker. In the elemental nations, the natural energy gave an old barely meter-tall toad enough strength to lift a 50-ton solid stone toad statue with ease. The boost from Senjutsu had been phenomenal, giving Naruto enough power to stand toe-to-toe with him for a time. Here, however, the polluted natural energy made it much less effective. He barely felt his attributes double from the natural energy, which was a far cry from the elemental nation's natural energy. He could still feel his senses expand greatly, but the natural boost was much less than if he simply used his Biju chakra. If he wanted the same effect as the elemental nations, he would have to purify the natural energy inside him before using it, something extremely difficult to do considering he himself was classified as a demon. Not impossible, but still difficult. It would take years of practice to be able to do that in combat, if not longer. That thought gave Kurama an idea, and he made a familiar cross shape before channeling his chakra in a familiar and nostalgic way. A puff of smoke appeared beside him before it cleared, revealing a perfect shadow clone of Kurama. The two Kuramas smiled widely at each other as they realized what this meant. He had been part of Naruto for so long that it wasn't a surprise he could create shadow clones on the first try. It was almost subconscious at this point. The fact he created only one showed he would need to work on it so he could create more, but once he did, he would be able to greatly speed up his training. Kurama got the memories of his clones when they dispelled, so making 2 clones and training all day would mean getting 3 days worth of training. 4 clones would mean 5, and so on and so forth. At his prime, Naruto had been able to create over 1,000 shadow clones, and Kurama aimed to match that feat. Once he did that, as long as he was careful not to dispel too many at once and dispelled them periodically so all the clones would get advances at once, he would be able to get years of training every day, greatly speeding up his training. Kurama smiled widely and laughed as he remembered the thousands of jutsus and techniques he had seen along his long life in the elemental nations. Due to being a Biju, he had perfect recall, so he remembered them perfectly and would be able to recreate most of them, probably not the bloodline techniques but the others. Oh yes. Kurama grinned as he started to create more shadow clones who went off to train what he remembered. Issei Hyodo groaned as he slowly returned to the world of the living. He opened his eyes to see a white ceiling above him, but when he tried to move, he winced as pain racked his body. He felt as if had been run over by a horde of angry gorillas. On steroids, confused as to the reason behind the pain, it took a while for the memories of the beating at Kurama's hands to filter through the haze of unconsciousness, not to mention possible brain damage from the beating. Once it did, he sat up straight, earning a strained hiss as pain racked through him and causing the person sitting beside his bed to take notice of his now awakened status, as well as alerting the nurses who went to alert his visitors outside. "Is-san!" yelled Asia in distress. She had been sitting by his bedside the entire time while he was recovering, waiting to see how he was so she could finish healing him. Seeing he was still in pain, Asia activated her twilight healing and healed the rest of his injuries. She had wanted to do so before, but the doctors forbid her, wanting him to wake up on his own first. Considering his current condition, they didn't want the possibility of foreign energy worsening his condition until they were sure he was at least conscious. Issei sighed in relief as he felt the pain of his injuries fade away, a part of him wondering why they hadn't healed him like this before. Once he felt the last of it fade, he opened his eyes to see his bed was now surrounded by his friends, Seraphal and Azazel, having entered the room while Asia healed him. They were all in various states of injury, making Issei wonder why Asia hadn't healed them yet. Stretching slightly and smiling when he felt no pain, he thanked Asia before turning to his visitors. "Hey guys. Guess I was the last to wake up?" "Yes, Issei," said Azazel with a worried frown. "How are you feeling?" Issei looked confused at the worried look on his face, which he realized was mirrored on everyone else's faces. "Better now that Asia's healed me. Did Asia just wake up, since I am wondering why she hasn't healed any of you?" Asia looked depressed at his words and the others frowned. "Something in the injuries is rejecting Asia's attempts at healing us," said Azazel with a deep frown. "Some kind of energy that is making her have to use a lot more energy than usual to heal us. Since the wounds weren't too bad and she's still recovering from her own injuries, we decided to let them heal naturally. We were more worried about you actually." "Me?" said Issei with a confused blink on his face before a nervous look came across it. "Is something wrong with me?" The look they all shared didn't reassure Issei at all, but Seraphal eventually answered, "First, you should know that it's been 2 days since the fight and you've been unconscious for all of it." Issei looked shocked at the revelation. Even when had died and been resurrected, he hadn't taken that long to heal. Heck, even after taking a light spear to the gut the day after, had healed overnight. 2 days. Yelped Issei in distress before his eyes widened. "The school trip. What are we going to do about?" "We've handled it," said Azazel abruptly. Easing his worries, we had to use a bit of mind magic to send the rest of the year back early, stating some kind of emergency, but they're all safe back at Kuo while we sort this all out. Rias and the others wanted to come, continued Serafal with a pout which turned into a frown, but we decided it was best if she stayed put. More devils coming here would only exacerbate the tension between our factions right now, which is the last thing we need. Issei grimaced as he remembered the beating they all received at Yusaka's husband's hands. Yeah, it was probably best if Rias was safe far away from here. He decided to change the subject. Were my wounds really that bad that it took so long to heal? Asked Issei nervously, inwardly wondering how he had survived if he had been so badly wounded. Again, Serafal and Azazel shared a look before the latter spoke. Actually, your wounds were pretty easy to heal and they healed quickly, but you still didn't wake up. It took a while, but we realized the possible reasons behind it, you see. However, before he could continue to explain, the door to the hospital wing opened once more, this time revealing the old Tengu, the Kitsune lady, and none other than Kuno walking in, the last with a worried frown. Said frown disappeared into relief when she saw Issei awake. Governor Dono, Mao Dono, said the old Tengu formally before turning to Issei. Issei Dono, I am relieved to see you have awoken. Kurama Dono assured us you would be fine, but we had begun to worry. How are you feeling? All this worry about him was starting to freak Issei out, but he answered regardless. I am fine now that Asia healed me. Is something wrong? The old Tengu frowned before looking from Azazel to Issei. They haven't told you? He just woke up, explained Azazel calmly. We haven't had time to explain his new condition yet. I am sorry, said Kuno with tears in her eyes. This is my fault. If I hadn't brought you here, none of this would have happened. Seeing the cute girl about to cry pulled on Issei's heartstrings, and despite the growing worry in the pit of his stomach, he smiled down at her reassuringly. It's not your fault, Kuno, so lift your head. Honestly, I don't know what you're all worried about. I feel fine if a bit weak. I am sure that's just from laying down for so long, and it'll be back to normal in no time. Actually, Azazel had a complicated look on his face. You won't, at least for a while yet. Have you tried to contact Diedrich yet? Issei blinked, just now realizing he hadn't heard his partner's voice since waking up. Usually, he would have said something by now, usually about how badly he had lost or how long it'll take to heal, but now there was nothing. Closing his eyes, Issei called out to his partner, Diedrich. You there, partner? Hearing only silence, Issei tried harder, the pit of unease in his gut solidifying. It was worse because ever since they first contacted each other, Issei had been able to feel Diedrich's presence even if he didn't speak, yet now he felt nothing. Come on, partner, are you okay? When he still heard nothing, Issei opened his eyes in panic. Guys, I can't feel Diedrich. Did something happen while I was asleep? The looks on the adults turned grim while the younger teens all frowned, looking disturbed. What is the last thing you remember before passing out, Issei? Asked Azazel seriously. Issei racked his brain before he remembered how Kurama knocked him out of the fight for good. Kurama disappeared in a red flash and appeared before Issei, surprising the boy. Before he could react, Kurama slammed his hand in a claw shape, each finger glowing a different color, into Issei's abdomen. 5 elements seal, yelled Kurama as he slammed his hand into the boy. Instantly, Issei felt as if something integral had been cut off from him, causing him to pass out from the shock. That guy, Kurama, said Issei slowly and nervously. He hit me with something. I think he called it some kind of seal. Azazel nodded grimly while the old Tengu looked guilty and apologetic. That confirms our theories and some of what Kurama Dono revealed to me after the fight. Apparently, Kurama Dono learned seals during his time away and has mastered them to an incredible point. If you could please, check your abdomen, the Tengu said. Complying, Issei lowered his sheets and lifted his hospital shirt slightly, causing the girl's sans serifal to blush at the sight, showing a new addition to his stomach area. There was some kind of design on his stomach that looked similar to a star with 5 points. Issei didn't understand the fancy designs or what it meant, but he got the feeling it wasn't good. What's this? Asked Issei in shock at his new tattoo. Oh Mao, his parents would kill him if they thought he got a tattoo. Head looked like some kind of delinquent. Worse, what would Bucko think? The doctors found it when they checked you over, and it was the only thing that could explain your condition, said Azazel with a grave look on his face. When the old Tengu questioned Kurama, he admitted that it was a seal and that it would wear off in about a month, but that he refused to take it off before then unless we promised to leave the capital for good. Issei looked at Azazel in slight fear. What does it do? Azazel sighed, before, despite the situation, an intrigued look came to his face as he explained. No matter what the situation, he was a scientist at heart. From what we've seen, it's a seal that cuts you off from your sacred gear. making it impossible for you to access it in any way. Kurama said it was a seal that cuts you off from foreign internal forces, forcing you to rely on something else. It really is quite fascinating, not to mention its myriad applications against enemy sacred gear wielders, some of the world's biggest threats. Taken down with just a simple-looking seal, it really is quite fascinating, he explained in his scientist tone. As well as terrifying, considering his unmatched speed, ability to seemingly teleport, strength and ruthlessness, he would be able to take down even Valley easily. While he was incredibly strong with his divine dividing, he was only high class to ultimate class without it. It was an ability that reminded Azazel strongly of another ability that a certain Satan descendant had that could cancel sacred gears with just a touch. Yet this seemed much more versatile. After all, this seemed like a simple seal in both form and application, yet was impossible to undo without the counter seal, at least not without possibly damaging Issei in a fatal way. Unlike that Mon's ability, it lasted longer and didn't have to be activated each time. While it wasn't permanent, it certainly negated a sacred gear wielder much better. Furthermore, this was just one seal, from what the old Tengu told me, Kurama said. The latter was a seal master who knew thousands of different seals. Some, from what he hinted, could be used to seal sacred gears away permanently. Seals had always been something that interested Azazel due to their application in creating sacred gears as well as his father's usage of them in sealing away a certain entity. However, even after millennia of study, he knew very little about sealing except the basics. Sealing was a very obscure art and the few who could use it kept their secrets very close to the chest, not to mention, he didn't even recognize this sealing style at all, which meant it might even be his own self-made style, and without a base to start off he couldn't even hope to undo it. This supposedly simple seal was beyond his ability, and if this was considered simple, he really didn't want to know what Kurama considered complex. Especially, since it didn't just seal away his sacred gear. There's more, Issei-kun, said Seraphal gently, knowing that this next piece of information might be taken badly. Rias certainly had. Can you reveal your devil wings? With a sense of utter dread, Issei tried to do just that, only for nothing to happen. Concentrating more deeply, Issei felt none of the admittedly small amount of demonic power he's had since he was reincarnated as a devil. The seal also sealed away the effects of your evil piece, said Azazel sadly. For all intents and purposes, you're just a normal human until the seal wears off. There was a beat of silence before Kurama flinched slightly as he walked down the streets toward his destination as one of his clones popped, transferring the memories of the training his clones were undergoing to him. This one was one of his close combat training clones, so his last memory was of failing to correctly block an incoming block which punched him hard enough that if it wasn't a clone, he would have lost his head. As Kurama continued toward his destination, he mused over his training the past 2 days as well as his investigations into his wife's kidnapping. After having confirmed to be able to create shadow clones, Kurama had divided them into 2 groups. One group would practice to master the various ninjutsu had seen over the centuries, with emphasis on his elemental affinities, fire and wind, until had mastered them. The second group, however, would work on his taijutsu. This group training would be done using the special shadow clones Naruto had created later in life, the self-named tank shadow clones. During his later years, Naruto had taken to experimenting with his various signature jutsu and techniques. After reaching the limit of how he could manipulate the Rasengan, he had turned to his other signature technique, the shadow clone jutsu. It had taken a few years, but he had discovered a way to overcome the shadow clone's weakness of dispelling with one hit no matter how much chakra he put in them. He did this by combining his own chakra with highly condensed traces of Kurama's Biju chakra, which was naturally already extremely dense. The result was an incredibly durable and stable clone that would only dispel with a lethal hit and still retained the ability to transfer all its memories upon doing so. Of course, for this seemingly great benefit, there were a few weaknesses. First was that no matter how much chakra they put into them, they never lasted longer than 24 hours, making them useless for long-term scouting missions. Kurama, nor Naruto, never understood the reasons behind this, but it had something to do with durability versus longevity, where adding to one side of the equation detracted from other. Second, was that they took an enormous amount of chakra to create, even in comparison to the already chakra-intensive regular shadow clones. At his prime, Naruto could create over 10,000 regular shadow clones, which he later named Scout Shadow Clones, but in comparison could only create 1,000 Tank Shadow Clones. In fact, he doubted anyone else. Even other Jinchuriki could create more than a dozen of his Tank Shadow Clones. Heck, maybe not even that, since as an Uzumaki, his chakra reserves were already incredibly dense and massive. Adding Kurama's seemingly limitless reserves meant that Naruto was truly a monster among monsters when it came to chakra reserves. Still, 1,000 tank clones were still a respectable amount, especially in battle. 1,000 Narutos, each about 1/10 as strong as the original, that could only dispel with a lethal hit was a terrifying force to face on the battlefield, especially since he still kept his incredible ability to hide among his clones flawlessly. Not even a Hyuga or Uchiha would be capable of telling them apart. For Kurama, he couldn't make quite that amount. He hadn't tested his limits, but he could make at least 100 without that much effort, so they made perfect clones to practice his taijutsu. They could cut loose and fight to kill without them dispelling too quickly, which was a weakness of the Scout Shadow clones, and allowed him slowly readjust to having a physical body again. In hindsight, his fight with the two Satan-class leaders of their respective factions was pathetic. He could have easily have taken them down in his base form alone if he had been capable of using all the techniques he had knowledge of. He knew firsthand that sheer power wasn't everything. For all their strength, neither Madara nor Hashirama ever had the sheer power to face him head-on, much less match his near-limitless chakra reserves. Despite that, they had access to techniques and abilities that neutralized his superior power and strength and turned him into little more than their pet. In the end, their natural abilities and techniques trumped his sheer power. For that reason, he was training himself to at least have basic competence in a large amount of skills and techniques while readjusting to having a flesh and blood body. He was making sure to cover all his bases so that he had no weaknesses. It would be embarrassing to the extreme if he was forced to enter his true Biju form for some puny human with a Longinus or something similar simply because he didn't have the sheer power in his base to simply overpower them. Therefore, getting used to his old, new body as well as polishing his hand-to-hand was a must if he planned to rescue his wife. Despite their arguments, Kurama would never say his wife wasn't strong, inexperienced in true combat. Perhaps she was, but her raw power more than made up for it against any but the strongest and most experienced opponents. This said several things about the ones who captured her. 1. They were obviously as strong or at least close in strength to ultimate class beings in strength and skill. Either they were humans with high-tier Longinus and were extremely skilled at using them, or they were several ultimate class beings. Another possibility was that they had something that allowed them to neutralize her power similar to Hashirama and Madara, but Kurama doubted such abilities existed in this world. True, he could do that with his mastery of sealing, but that was an extremely rare and obscure art in this world, to the point that there had only been 3 confirmed users of it, one of which was dead now. However, it was much more likely to have been a Longinus user. Before dying, one of his wife's surviving guards spoke of a strange mist that appeared from nowhere and covered them just as they were attacked. Research showed Kurama that one sacred gear, specifically a Longinus, had a similar ability that would explain not only how his wife was taken but why there was no evidence of a fight anywhere nearby. Dimension Lost. Dimension Lost had the ability to transport anything inside its mist to an artificial space. If it was a Dimension Lost user, they could have easily have transported his wife's entire group to a place of their choosing where they had the advantage. It would also explain why they couldn't find their wife despite she was obviously still in Kyoto. This artificial space was obviously connected to Kyoto, which meant his wife could still maintain the ley lines while still being impossible to find. This led to the second thing that his wife's capture revealed. There was a traitor among them. Even if they had a Dimension Lost user, it wouldn't explain how they not only located her far from the palace's protections but also managed to ambush them. This would only be possible if they knew about the planned meeting and possible route beforehand. Questioning the old Tengu revealed that very few on their side knew about her planned meeting with Sun Wukong, and those that did were almost above reproach. Kurama still had disguised clones keeping an eye on them, but he had the feeling the traitor didn't come from his side, or at least not the only traitor. This left only one option: Sun Wukong's party. While he didn't believe Sun Wukong had anything to do with it, those on his side who knew of the upcoming meeting were unknown to Kurama and therefore prime suspects. It was for this reason he wanted everyone not of their faction out of Kyoto. The more people involved, the more chances that there was a leak among them. Finding his wife would be useless if they knew he was coming. After all, they could either move her before he arrived or prepare for his coming. And he was not gambling his beloved wife's life with him in a less than peak state. Even 2 days hadn't been enough to explore all the limits of his new strength. He had a good idea of the limits of his current base form, which easily reached Satan class in power, but his higher forms were still beyond him. Among them was entering Sage mode, which still escaped him. Kurama scowled at the thought of his repeated failures in his once familiar and easy ability, but stopped all thoughts about it as he reached his destination. He was currently standing in front of a familiar bar on the edge of what was considered the bad side of town. From the rowdy music sound of talking coming from inside, Kurama could tell that business was obviously booming despite the extremely early, or late depending on how you looked at it, hour, with the sun just peeking over the horizon. As soon as he entered the bar, he saw the obvious reason for the many patrons even at this early hour. There was a squirrel yukai dressed in an almost scandalous combination of an orange fighter top that only covered the top half of her large breasts, that almost matched his wife's in size, black strap panties with an orange skirt-like cloth, long black stockings and orange boots. She was obviously the waitress, considering she was wailing around seemingly taking orders, though from the way the patrons were eyeing her, they probably didn't even know what they ordering. Not that Kurama could blame them. If he wasn't a happily taken man married to a literal goddess, he would have already been getting to know the squirrel yukai much better. Gods, it had been a long time. Yasaka won't be able to walk straight ever again once he was done with her. Sighing to himself, Kurama turned away from the admittedly lovely sight toward the barman, signaling him to get his attention. The barman, a Baku by the look and smell of him, approached him once he was done talking to a customer and grunted slightly. "Can I help you?" "Yeah," said Kurama as he discreetly passed over 10,000 yen over the table. "I heard that there was a girl named Makoto Nanaya here. Can you tell me where I can find her?" The barman took the bribe, checked that it was genuine before grunting and nodding over Kurama's shoulder. "Oh, Makoto, you got a solicitor." Turning, Kurama saw the waitress he had seen beforehand turn at the call and look at him in confusion. Suddenly, she seemed to recognize him because she beamed at him before dropping what she was doing and running toward him into a flying tackle with a cry of "Uncle Kura." Kurama's eyes widened even as he reflexively opened his arms to accept the hug, his mind running miles at this recent revelation. Makoto had been a young squirrel yukai that he had adopted back during the Civil War. Her parents had been killed by some asshole noble who tried to shake them down, but when they resisted, had killed them for offending him. Kurama had found the traumatized and orphaned Makoto not long after and taken her under his wing, teaching her how to defend herself in this harsh world. Eventually, she had become their unofficial little spy, using her cuteness and young age to get people to talk about things around her they usually wouldn't around others. Thanks to her, they had gotten a lot of information that saved their butts in later conflicts. After the war, Kurama had been at a loss at what to do with her though. He wanted to take her to the palace, but he didn't want her exposed to the sometimes brutal politics of the place. She had seen enough bloodshed during the war as it was and deserved some semblance of a normal life. Eventually, Kurama and the other 4 generals had decided on buying a small house where one of them would be at all times to watch over her while she went to a nearby school. It had been extremely dysfunctional, especially considering Makoto was in no ways normal and never really got along with the other kids her age. It didn't help that Kurama and the others were equally strange, and where another parent would be dismayed, Kurama had only been proud when he found out that Makoto basically controlled her school and its teachers through a mix of bribery and blackmail. It was hard to compare that young girl that always had a cute scheming look on her face to the voluptuous bombshell currently hugging him. It actually made him feel slightly ill that he had basically been turned on by someone he had considered an adopted little sister. Damn it, thought Kurama as he hugged the beauty while trying, and failing, not to get an erection at the feel of her body against his, first Rosweiss and now Makoto. Did every girl I know when they were young turn into total babes? He hadn't really noticed during the fight, but Rosweiss had grown up really well. I mean, damn, she was almost as hot as his wife, and his wife could give Aphrodite a run for her money. Kurama was brought out of his thoughts and attempts to stop his erection when Makoto broke the hug and smiled up at him. "Uncle Kurama, where have you been? You just disappeared one day and we couldn't find you." Kurama flinched at the hurt tone hidden beneath her cheerful exclamation. It was obvious she was hiding the deep hurt his disappearance had caused, and it sent yet another dagger of guilt into his heart. Damn it, but had been selfish when had taken the old man's offer. Kurama gave a strained smile. "I'll tell you all about it after. Can you talk or are you busy?" At that, Makoto turned to the barman. "Hey, Ren. I am going to take my break now, is that all right?" The now named Ren shrugged and nodded, making Makoto turn back to him. "I am now. Come on, let's go to my apartment." Nodding, Kurama followed the girl now woman out of the bar. Ignoring the wolf whistles and catcalls from the other customers with gritted teeth, he made a mental note to punch each of their lights out at the first opportunity. They eventually reached a nearby apartment complex and Kurama frowned at its barely standing state. The idea of the little girl had adopted living in this place put a bad taste in his mouth, and he made a mental note to talk to his wife about letting Makoto live in this kind of place. They quickly walked up the staircase to the 3rd floor, Makoto greeting the people she passed by name and an inquiry about a friend or family member. Anyone else would have taken her as simply being concerned, but Kurama noticed how Makoto steered the conversation, so they revealed more than most would, such as how one man's wife was annoyed at him having allowed his sick mother to stay with them, or how one woman suspected her husband was cheating on her with her best friend. Kurama smirked to himself as Makoto did all this, all while seeming kind and affable, giving support all while not promising anything. It was this ability that made Makoto such a good spymaster during the Civil War. her ability to seem completely kind and unassuming so you don't suspect anything until she slit your throat. They eventually reached her apartment and she let him in with a flourish, letting him enter first. Kurama looked around and saw it was a cozy little place, though considering the mess, it seemed Makoto's cleaning habits, none whatsoever, hadn't changed. Still, it gave off a feeling of home, so he imagined she must like it well enough. Naruto had been abnormally attached to his apartment and had only moved out after marrying Hinata despite having the money to do so before. "So how have you started?" Kurama, only to be cut off quite abruptly. Slap. Kurama blinked as his mind caught up to the fact that the slight sting on his left cheek did indeed come from being slapped by his cute little sister. He blinked once more before turning back to Makoto, who was now glaring at him with tears at the corner of her eyes. "You better start talking," growled Makoto through gritted teeth. "You better have a good explanation as to where you've been all these years, or so help me, I am going to kick your ass so bad you won't be able to sit down for a week." Usually, Kurama would react extremely harshly to being hit, but two things stopped him. 1. This was Makoto. The cute little girl had adopted as his little sister. He could no more lay a hand on her than he could rip out his internal organs. Okay, that was a bad example since he could actually do that and survive thanks to his healing factor, but you get the point. Another reason was the look on her face. It was a look of absolute emotional pain that broke his heart. Kurama grimaced. Kami, he was a selfish dick. When the old man had come with his offer, he hadn't even thought of all those he was hurting with his disappearance. He could only imagine what his disappearance had done to this girl who had already lost her parents when she was young. Sighing, Kurama sat down with a guilty look on his face. "I am not going to lie. My reason was very selfish. An old man came and offered power in exchange for coming with him to do something for a while. He said it would take a while, but I would be back, so I didn't even think about it twice." Kurama looked away, not wanting to meet Makoto's eyes. "You know what that kind of offer would have done to me." Makoto grimaced and frowned as she realized exactly how tempting that offer would have been to Kurama. Even at 12, she had seen how obsessed with power he had been. She never knew the exact reason, but she guessed it had something to do with his deceased sister. He had been extremely overprotective of her, and she had heard him mutter once or twice that he wouldn't fail her like he failed his sister. She had a few hypotheses as to what happened, and none of them good. So someone appearing promising him power with the only price being away for a little while. Yeah, he probably didn't even hesitate. Makoto sighed. She didn't forgive him, not by a long shot. His disappearance had hurt her deeply and she'd been a mess for years afterwards. However, she wasn't exactly sane or normal by any definition. None of their weird family had been. They all had distorted personalities that would get them thrown into a loony bin in the human world. Makoto herself had an obsessive paranoid need to know everything about everyone around her, in some desperate need to have some measure of control of her life. She spied on everyone she came into even the slightest contact with and trusted almost no one. If she couldn't figure someone out, she would become paranoid that they were out to get her and either try to kill them or move away from them out of fear. Therefore, she could understand why Kurama had done it. Didn't mean she had to like it though. "Fine," said Makoto through gritted teeth. "I am still furious with you, and if you ever do something like this again you're going to wish you were dead, but..." Makoto's voice softened as tears started to drop down her face. "I am more happy that you're back than anything." Kurama smiled and hugged his adopted little sister gently, letting her sob in his shoulder. He knew they were not even close to being back to the way they were before or even okay, but the fact that she was willing to try and reconnect with him made him smile. But first, he needed her help. Kurama gently separated from her and gave her a serious look. "I would love to catch up, but I need your help." "Yusaka, right?" said Makoto, smiling at his surprised look. "Don't look so surprised. I was the information specialist of our group. There was no way I wouldn't know about her kidnapping." Kurama smiled slightly before getting serious. "That, too, but I also need you to get me up to speed." At Makoto's look, he elaborated. "I've been gone for over 12 years and I imagine a lot has happened since then. I've got a Satan and the Governor General of the Grigori, not to mention about a dozen assorted reincarnated devils and an angel at the palace. I need to know the current political climate so I know how to move forward." Makoto rose an eyebrow in surprise at him. "You? Wanting to know about politics? Are you sure you're Kurama?" Makoto stopped teasing him and got serious. "Sit down because we have a lot to go over." So Kurama sat down as Makoto told him everything that had happened since had been gone. It was close to sunset and Serafal was still waiting by the entrance of the palace for Kurama to return. The temporary leader of Kyoto had left near sunrise and had yet to return. She had been waiting, hoping to convince him to change his mind about working together to find Yusaka. If she had been taken by the Chaos Brigade, they needed to put aside their differences and join forces to get her back. Hopefully, this would also help set the foundation for a more stable alliance between them later on. Seraphol had worked hard to try and create better relations with the various other factions over the centuries. She truly wanted to create a better future not only for her race but for her little sister. A world where she didn't have to live in fear anymore. Seraphol perked up when she saw a familiar figure approaching and put on her best smile to try and convince Kurama to accept their help. However, as the male Kyuubi approached, Seraphol started to get a bad feeling. She had seen him angry and frankly it had scared her more than she was willing to admit. His rage was a terrifying thing to behold. But now Kurama's face wasn't angry or even irritated at her presence but strangely blank, empty of all feeling, which for some reason scared her all the more. It showed nothing as to his feelings, but the closer he got, the more uneasy Seraphol became. She found herself unconsciously tensing the closer he approached. Trying to ignore her feeling of unease, Seraphol gave her best smile and tried to break the ice the way she always did. "Kura-kun, how are yo?" Seraphol was abruptly cut off when Kurama's fist slammed into the wall beside her so fast that she couldn't even track its movements. She instantly froze as Kurama's furious face filled her vision. "I want you and your fucking people out of Inner Kyoto tonight," growled Kurama, his eyes now a solid glowing crimson that sent chills up Seraphol's spine. "If any of you are still here come morning, I will fucking send them back to you in pieces." Seraphol's eyes widened at the sheer rage in Kurama's voice. She had no idea what had changed, but something had obviously happened during the day to make any goodwill toward them completely disappear. He had been willing to let them stay at the palace while they recuperated this morning but now seemed to want them gone for some reason. "Kurama Dono, please, we need to work together to get Yusaka-chan back. We can't let old hatreds prevent us from." Seraphol quickly tried to run damage control. "Old hatreds?" yelled Kurama in anger, drawing the attention of others who stopped to watch the spectacle. "Tell me, oh wise Satan," spat Kurama angrily as he leaned over her. "Do you know what I am?" At Seraphol's confused look, he continued, "You see, I am not a pure kitsune. No, I am a hybrid, a mix of kitsune and nekomata." Kurama grinned darkly as Seraphol froze at that, paling rapidly. "Yes, I found out about your devil's hunting of my people, my family. All because of what one Nekosho did and fear. And you want me to work with you? Work alongside a race which hunted and murdered members of my race on my bloodfather's side? Tell me, Leviathan." Seraphol winced at the mocking in his tone. "How would you feel if I went and murdered your beloved sister? If I raped and killed her and put her corpse at your feet? Tell me, would you be so willing to work together then?" Seraphol's face grew cold at the threat to her sister, and it took everything she had not to lash out at him, remembering that not only was he stronger than her and she was injured but that he had very good reason to be angry. "We tried to stop the hunts but we couldn't be everywhere," tried Seraphol quickly. "We can't control every devil's actions." "No, but you can punish them for it," retorted Kurama with a snarl. "By punishing the ones responsible, you would have sent a message to the rest that their actions were not tolerated. Instead you just let them get away with it, unofficially saying you supported their actions and that they wouldn't be punished for them. And don't tell me you don't know exactly who was responsible. I've been back for 3 days and I know the main culprits." Seraphol grimaced at his words. The truth was they did know the main culprits behind the unofficial hunting of the Nekomata. The problem was that they were very high up, politically speaking. And trying to get them tried and punished for their hunting of the Nekomata would have been futile at best, no matter how much better their race had gotten. Most devils believed themselves automatically better than any other race, and the idea of being punished for killing one of them unthinkable to them. It would be like hunters being prosecuted for hunting deer in their eyes, and any attempt to do so would be dismissed from the courts before they could even get to trial. Get out," snarled Kurama. "The only reason I am not killing you and your little group of brats and sending their heads back to the other Satans as a message of peace is because my wife is still missing, and right now, she's my priority. But make no mistake, Seraphol Citri, he purposefully forsook her title to show how little respect he had for her. There will be a reckoning for this, I guarantee it," he growled darkly. With that, Kurama entered the palace, the gathered spectators instantly moving aside to let him through, knowing he might take out his anger at them in his current state. Seraphol stayed where she was before releasing a frustrated sigh. "Damn it, thanks for watching."